So here's the deal. This story is about Jun Hyuk's journey into the past. With difficulty, he obtains the rollback stone, and armed with keen senses and the ability to copy, he sets out on a daring mission to right his wrongs. On the outskirts of devastated Seoul was gloomy. It had been 5 years since the day of the catastrophe for all mankind. The mutants stared bloodthirstily in front of them. They were looking for prey. The monster with horns appeared in the street. It was from that day on that unidentified mutants flowed out of the gates that appeared all over the world. The guy was sitting on a rooftop all alone. The city was in shambles. He had nowhere to go. Heck sat back and lowered his head sullenly. He wondered how it was that 40% of humanity was still surviving. The protagonist reached for the phone. He pondered whether he had somewhere to call in this situation. Suddenly the guy turned around and was surprised to see the walls that had been erected from reinforced alloys. The protagonist with headphones in hand abruptly ran to the edge of the roof and looked down into the street. There was a huge crowd of various mutants walking down the street. Heck was scared. He heard through his headphones that he should have just looked around. Heck pondered the information that the population of safe zones was causing a shortage of supplies. The guy calculated that there were 6 monsters above Class 6 and 1 Class A monster outside. The protagonist was startled to realize that everything happens just as Hyungi Chul said. Heik abruptly and fearfully grabbed the binoculars. He watched carefully and searched the street for danger. The boy saw only dilapidated houses in front of him. He was frightened by the oppressive silence. The protagonist, after a little thought, realized that it's going to get hot very soon. Very suddenly, bright lightning bolts appeared in the center of the deserted area. A crackling sound was heard in the surrounding area, and everything brightly lit up. Heck rejoiced. He realized that he had just seen the sudden gate through his binoculars. The dangerous fire in the street stopped more and more. A dark portal appeared in the center. Heik looked into the portal with interest. He waited to see exactly which person would emerge from there. Gradually, a strange guy appeared right in the center of the bright flash. He covered his face with his hands. The stranger jumped out of the portal at high speed. He barely had time to brake with his foot. The guy held his hands in front of his face. He decided to protect himself from possible danger. The stranger was still a little scared. He couldn't believe he'd come to the right place. The guy couldn't be afraid of anything anymore. He threw his hands up in the air and shouted that he could finally make it back. The man had no idea what danger awaited him just around the corner. The mutants gave him an angry look. The monsters didn't waste any time. They saw their prey and ran at full speed towards the man. The fighter was frightened. He didn't expect to see mutants around and didn't understand what was going on. The stranger was scared out of his wits when he saw the monsters in the street. He didn't understand why the mutants were still here. The protagonist was having fun. He was already watching the stranger in the square without binoculars. One of the mutants with burning eyes very quickly swung his arm to finish off his prey. The protagonist felt interest and excitement. He realized that everything in front of him was just beginning. The deserted street was gradually illuminated. The unknown guy prepared to fight off the dangerous monsters. There were already bloody marks on the fighter's face. The protagonist watched him and realized that he would be facing one low-class monster. The enraged stranger realized that he needed to attack with magical weapons. He activated the sword nest. The deserted square glowed brightly. Brightly colored magical swords flew at the bottom. They flew towards the guy. Heck looked down and estimated that 10 high-ranked hunters were needed to fight the monsters. The stranger looked sternly at the mutant beside him. He pointed his magic swords towards him to attack. The fighter strained with all his might against the monster. He extended his arm forward. The magic swords continued to fly at full speed. The fighter attacked the numerous mutants with all his might. The magic weapon proved effective. The monster was struck by the glowing blades. Heck realized with surprise that the stranger had slashed 6 dangerous monsters in just an hour. The huge mutant could not withstand the man's attack and dropped dead right next to the guy on the ground. Heck was surprised to realize that the stranger had won completely by himself. The fighter felt joy, and at the same time anger from the victory over the mutant. The protagonist watched him carefully and realized that there was only one A-class monster left. A huge mutant with enemies stood and calmly stared at the man in the deserted square. Heck thought with excitement that even again S-class hunters would not be able to defeat such a monster. Heck looked at the square with great interest. He thought he could see the true power of the Spearmaster before him. The mutant wasted no time. To finish the man off, he launched pink energy at him. Heck was suddenly very frightened and excited. The battle interested him even more. He realized that the power could be his. The dangerous mutant kept attacking the guy with pink energy. Everything around him was brightly lit up. The fighter was ready for his opponent's attack. He jumped up sharply above the ground to get back from danger. The stranger strained with all his might in flight. He used a phantom throw. The guy decided to attack. He jumped on top of the monster and chopped it with a demonic blade. Then he landed. The stranger was fully confident that he had crushed the enemy. He sat calmly on the ground with his back to the monster's body. Heck was very excited about the battle he saw. He said cheerfully that it was a battle beyond comprehension. The stranger was badly wounded during the fight and fell to the ground dead. The protagonist rushed to him and told himself that he had to go. The protagonist approached the square and scrutinized the unconscious stranger. So far, everything was going just as Hyung-gi Chul had said before. Heck decided not to waste a moment. He walked over to the stranger and put his hand on him. He wondered if the fighter was in any condition. The protagonist looked at the fighter's body. He remembered. Someone had gotten another man's power when he tried to save him. Heck kept his hand on the stranger's body. Suddenly the guy coughed up blood. The protagonist thought he didn't know exactly how he could help the stranger. Life returned to the fighter. He opened his eyes and asked in a weak voice, "What year is it?" The main character was very excited. He told the stranger that it was August 2035. Heck was very surprised to see that the stranger had found the strength to lift himself on his hands from the ground. The stranger was surprised when he realized what year it was outside. He had been gone 30 years, but realistically, only 5 years had passed. The protagonist was worried about his new acquaintance. He shouted for the guy not to make any unnecessary movements and just lie down. The fighter said in an apathetic voice that it was very late. Heck tried to hide his emotions. He was already well aware that the stranger was going to die today. The exhausted fighter reasoned that he had expended a great deal of energy to open the gate. The protagonist was silent. He didn't even know how he could cheer up strangers. The fighter pulled out a small photo card. Did he ask his interlocutor to find his family? Heck saw an image of his father with his children in front of him. The stranger asked the boy to take care of his surviving family members. Heck was surprised to hear such a strange request. He handed the picture back to the stranger and said he was in no position to help anyone. The stranger grudgingly told the protagonist that he would give him his power. Heck jumped to his feet and got excited when he heard about the power. The fighter told the protagonist in a stammering voice that he needed his name to pass on the power. The protagonist remembered that the world had been battered by apocalypse-like disasters. The stranger still decided to introduce himself and said his name was Pak Kang-ho. He inquired about the name of the person he was talking to. The main character recalled his youth as he lay beaten in some warehouse. There were always two common themes in his life. The blonde looked angrily at the protagonist and said contentedly as they met, "It was the summer of 2058. Everything was happening in Young Hyuk's hideout." He was sitting silently by a closet in the warehouse. The blonde man in armor glared angrily at the silent protagonist. He called him a pathetic, villainous scum. Only now the protagonist felt some pain in his body. He looked at his stomach and noticed a wound there. Hyuk felt the pain intensify after looking at the wounds on his stomach. The desperate protagonist realized that he could no longer escape this time. He asked his abusers who told them he was here. The blonde man angrily told the protagonist that a villain named Cha Jin-soo gave him all the details for $1 million. Heek was very angry that his friend named Soo had given out all the information about him to someone else. The main character somehow abruptly remembered the death of his parents and his younger brother and sister. The blonde man pulled out a huge sword and told his interlocutor that it was time for him to die. Heek thought sharply as unfamiliar words began to make sense to him. The protagonist held out his palm with a gray stone in front of him. He asked the people in front of him if they knew what it was. The blonde stopped talking very abruptly with excitement as he looked at the artifact in the guy's hand. Hyuk said in an excited voice that he had an artifact called a rollback stone. The blonde guy was really scared. He shouted to the fighters to kill the protagonist as soon as possible. The artifact in the sitting guy's hand glowed brightly. The fighters had no time to run up to him. The protagonist laughed a demonic laughter. He shouted to his attackers that they would meet in the past. His last words were Jonathan Curtis. The main character wanted to travel back to a time before the crash, or when his brother and sister were still alive. Heck glanced at his trembling hand. After a return of 23 years, he had entered the world of the past. The protagonist felt calm. He gave the stranger his full name. The main character decided to help the fighter. He gave him a hand to get him back on his feet. The stranger reached out his hand and grasped the protagonist's arm with it. The stranger shouted that the system transfer was starting. The deserted square began to change. White beams jumped out from under the earth. Two guys stood in the center. The fighter confirmed with a smile. He was already a dead man. The system reported the arrival of a new user named Choi Chun-hyuk. The protagonist stood in a blinding white space. The system started to transfer the copy master. The surprised protagonist was transported from space to the real world. The system had finished creating the second original, and the master of copies had begun. Heck looked at the deserted street with dilapidated buildings. The sky was dark, and the surrounding area was deserted. The system started scanning the body of a new user named Choi Hyuk. The protagonist looked at the stranger on Earth. The fighter was lying facing the Earth. He said he had handed over the body and he himself had to be careful. The protagonist excitedly asked the stranger what he said. Guy and did not notice the huge mutant who came up behind him. The menacing extended scream of a dangerous predator made the boy come to his senses. Hyuk turned around fearfully at the mutant. The fighter lay unmoving and said that life was very bad. The mutant with burning eyes was very dangerous. It had a huge hole in its body, but it still had the strength to attack people. The stranger said in a faint voice that in fantasy novels, people go home and live happily ever after. He turned to the main character. Hyuk was scared. He glanced at the mutant behind him. The fighter told the guy to forget about the power transfer. He just needed to run away. The protagonist looked around carefully. The body of the fighter was still lying on the ground. He saw his leg. Fighter, not raising his head, said goodbye to the protagonist to adapt and survive. Hake very quickly bent down to the ground and grabbed the metal pipe in his hands. His new friend was very surprised. The protagonist, with a pipe in his hands and a confident voice, said he was sick of running away. Hake stood on the ground in front of a huge monster. He decided to fight it off with a metal pipe. The guy was scared and tried not to show his emotions. He looked at the mutant with an unblinking gaze. The monster suddenly turned his back to the man and stepped aside. The main character felt relaxed. He almost died from the exertion. He then dropped the pipe from his hands. A fighter lying motionless told the protagonist that he was lucky. Hyuk replied that it was all thanks to him. The protagonist reminded his interlocutor that the monster was seriously injured thanks to him. The protagonist fearfully shouted to the stranger that his body was disappearing. The fighter reminded his interlocutor in a faint voice to find his family and take care of them. Lastly, the guy threatened for the protagonist not to break his promise. Hyuk looked at him silently. The system has completed the boot process. The user body was inappropriate. Hyuk silently looked in front of him. The system reported that the body had begun to rebuild through awakening. The protagonist only heard at the last moment that body realignment could bring him pain. There was an unpleasant sensation in his body. Hyuk grimaced in pain. He was in the process of waking up. The protagonist tried his best to hold on, but he was in a lot of pain. Hyuk felt as if every bone in his body was breaking and his flesh was falling apart. The pain in the guy's body was so intense that he screamed very loudly. Suddenly, a car of some kind appeared on the street of the ruined city. The driver in the cab was completely relaxed. He didn't realize he might have met someone here. The chauffeur was very surprised when he met the man in the street. He stopped immediately. The driver realized he saw the protagonist in front of him. Hek approached the back of the car, standing near the sidewalk. Hake was standing near the back of a car. At the same time, a small truck approached him from the side. The main character went over and greeted the chauffeur. He called him by his name, Gacheol Hyung. The chauffeur looked out of the cab and reminded the guy with surprise that he was supposed to have the day off today. The main character said in an exculpatory voice that he wanted to go back. Then he saw the monster and was stuck in that place. G was very amazed when he heard from the guy that he stayed in this place for the whole night. The main character happily put his hand on the load in the car. He said in a cheerful voice that he had hit the jackpot. The main character asked the driver, "And why was he here at this hour?" Hyuk didn't understand where the rest of the team had gone. Gu told his interlocutor excitedly that he had just been waking up early lately and had arrived early today. The main character smilingly replied to the driver that he understood him. He thought to himself that the driver was hiding something useful again. The driver stood in the middle of the street in a fighting stance and began to talk about what Jung Tai had told him. Hyuk looked at him intently. The protagonist calmly looked at his interlocutor. He knew that Pak Gi-chul was the leader of the hyena team. He was the owner of the Master Copy ability that he had stolen today. Master Copy could copy and use the abilities of other awakened ones. Hyuk thought it was because of this ability that the Master had become an outcast among the other awakened ones. He was eventually found dead in an abandoned building. The main character joyfully jumped into the car and shouted to the driver that he was leaving. He wished him a good job. Hek was speeding down the street in the cab of a truck at full speed. He thought excitedly about the skills that come hard to get. The main character with glasses sat behind the wheel and looked carefully at the road. At the last moment he thought about copying abilities. Suddenly something caught the boy's attention. He turned his gaze sideways. Hyuk saw very beautiful pebbles on the seat. They were multicolored crystals of several classes. The protagonist sat at the wheel and scrutinized the rocks he had pulled down. He remembered that he had almost died for them. The guy was holding a pink stone. He wondered what to do with it now. The protagonist held the stone in his hands and kept looking at it. The main character came to the street with a pink stone in his hands. He thought that Ji, after waking up with the power of Kanho, was so badly shaken that he didn't even get to the trophies. Hyuk stood outside among the dismembered bodies of the monsters. He knew that Guy was returning to this place the next day. The protagonist saw a bright rock on the ground and rushed towards it at full speed. Ji thought about this moment and wished he had taken care of the trophies. The protagonist ran around the square with great attention and collected colorful pebbles. Hake threw a pile of colorful rocks on the ground. He had planned to take the loot from the start. The protagonist looked at the chair where the crystals lay. He thought about what would happen if he put them up for sale. Hek was driving the car at full speed. He thought that the Awakened Association and the government were going to find out where the stones came from. The main character was sitting behind the wheel and thought he could sell the crystals for cheap. The protagonist picked up the phone. He realized he had only one conclusion. Hek started calling somewhere. He realized that he had to register as an awakened person now. The interlocutor greeted the protagonist and asked why he was calling him. The main character cheerfully told a friend named Kang Chul-min over the phone that he would like to have a drink with him. The friend got excited when he heard about the drinks and appetizers. The protagonist was driving a car on a deserted road. He warned his friend that he must first earn a treat. Kan asked his interlocutor what had happened. Hek was speeding on the freeway. He was entering a safe zone in Seoul. On the phone, he explained to his friend that he owed him a favor. The protagonist in the car was traveling at full speed to Seoul. He reminded his friend that he owed him a favor. Hyuk drove up to the building. He wanted to sell the stones. He wasn't happy with the price right away. The salesman offered the protagonist $600 for all of his crystals. The guest grudgingly asked the employee for a little more. The salesperson explained to the customer that the number of people looking for an expensive item has dropped dramatically. He didn't know what to say to the salesman or what to ask of him. The seller explained in a bored voice that prices were rising and people were simply spending money. At the same time, excited children appeared at the side. They ran towards the protagonist. The boy along with the girl were very crying. They ran to the main character and called him brother. The children hugged the boy from both sides. The boy asked tearfully to Hyuk, "Why did he come back only now?" He looked at the children and didn't know what he could say to them now. Hyuk named the girl after Choi Eun-jung. He named the boy after Choi Eun-chul. The main character sternly ordered the children that they should have been in school a long time ago. The worker calmly explained to the guy that the kids came because of him, as they were worried. A co-worker advised the protagonist to think more about the children instead of money. Hake looked at the kids and wondered why they were crying. Chol quickly wiped his face and said he wasn't crying at all. The girl next to him did the same. The guy told the kids that he was going to fry them meat for lunch. The boy and girl got very excited. Jung said in a satisfied voice that she liked meat. The girl looked at the protagonist and wanted to tell him something important. The girl told him that Hyuk should stop by the hostess's grandmother's house when he got back. Jong informed her brother that the landlady was reminding him about the overdue rent. The main character went up to the apartment. He was sitting there with the landlady and the other children. There was a lot of food on the table. The main character roasted meat for everyone in the house. There was complete silence at the table. Opposite the protagonist sat the hostess. Grandma looked at the boy and wondered, why did he bring all this? Hake took a piece of meat in his hand with chopsticks. He informed his mistress that he had gone into the butcher shop and thought of her. The hostess looked unhappily at the boy and said that he had better bring something for the children. The main character held out an envelope with money for the landlady. It was the rent. The grandmother replied that there was no need to hurry. The landlady informed the guy that he'd been having a hard time lately, so she decided to charge him half the rent. The main character reassured the hostess and explained that there was no need for that. The guy took the food with chopsticks and told the people at the table that they should help each other in difficult times. Grandma got angry. She swung her spoon and hit the surprised guy on the head with it. The boy grudgingly told his grandmother that after she died, the house would still belong to him. The old woman angrily told the frightened interlocutor named Chan-su that he was the reason she had stomach problems and poor sleep. The girl and the boy were carefully eating their food at the table with appetite. The grandmother told the boy that he was being silly and calling himself a porter. Chan excitedly told his grandmother that he was studying how hunters fight. It would help him when he was awakened. The main character listened attentively. Chan jumped to his feet and explained that it was now the time of the awakened hunters. The landlady wasn't happy. She told the main character to talk to the guy to listen to him. The grandmother said that the guy is the only one she has left, and he is very immature. The main character called his friend Khan. Heck was standing on the roof with the phone. Khan informed his friend that he could come over to see him at the request of the team captain. The protagonist rejoiced at such news. The interlocutor explained to the guy that it would all be free of charge. Khan told his overjoyed friend that if he did well, he would be added to the list of permanent team members. Khan wondered to a friend on the phone why he was interested in a porter's job. Heck said in a calm voice that it's getting harder and harder for him to work in Hyena. So he's looking for other options. Khan told his friend to be at the 7th gate on the western wall tomorrow morning. Hyuk said goodbye to his interlocutor and disconnected his phone. The protagonist scrutinized the city from above and thought that everything was going according to plan. The next day, the protagonist went to the big gate. He did it all according to plan. Hake turned around and looked away. He decided to copy the tank skill today and go straight to the association. The protagonist's friend appeared at the side. He told him with a smile that he had come early. Hak waved his hand and greeted Cheol-min cheerfully. He thought he'd register as a tank and get some basic equipment. Min told the protagonist in a joyful voice that his friend in battle armor was standing next to him. The guy looked at the main character and said that he was the captain of a team named Tank Yu San-jin. Heck held out his new friend's hand. He said he looked forward to working with him. The main character grabbed the tank and shook his hand. At this time, the copying process began. The system informed the host that he could choose one of the 3 skills presented. The unique skill gave the host a great defense. It could be used without registering in the skill deck. A unique skill gave a person the ability to hit an opponent with a shield. With the card skill, the host could release a powerful aura. It was possible to increase the aggression coefficient. Hyuk was very excited when he saw the possibility of skills. He confirmed to the system that he wanted to copy Iron Skin, Shield Strike, and Suppression. The system informed the protagonist that he had run out of skill duplication. Heck was still holding Tank's hand. The main character was very excited that he had copied the tank's skills in just one handshake. The tank was suddenly silent. He looked down at the protagonist's hand in amazement. Min looked at his friend in surprise and wondered what had happened to him there. Heck stood there with a frightened look. His friend asked him angrily, why was he grinning during the handshake? Tank looked happily at his new friend and said that one had a very firm handshake. Heck was very frightened and abruptly let go of the fighter's arm. Tank replied to him that they were fine and would give it their best shot. The tank pointed his hand with his finger forward. There was a truck with people. The main character had to climb up there. The guy with red hair very cheerfully extended his hand to his friend with the hat. The girl was standing with the guy. They were holding battle bows. A young driver was sitting in the cab of a car. A girl was standing in the street, looking thoughtfully at her phone. The tank said for the protagonist to greet the team members first. Heck noted to himself that all the people around him were first rank awakened. The protagonist thought about it and realized that very soon the skills he would take from these people would become useless to him. The guy looked at his hand. He decided to copy the skills first, then delete. A black truck was speeding on the highway. A city block was visible nearby. The protagonist sat silently in the back of the car. He had already copied 13 skills during the trip. Hake looked straight in front of him. He noted to himself that he had copied 3 of the healer's skills. The girl was sitting there, completely absorbed in her phone. Hake turned his gaze to the side. He gained 1 cartographer skill and 2 trapper skills. The passengers in the back of the car were dozing thoughtfully. Hake realized that he had obtained the 7 attack skills. Heck looked carefully at his companions with bows in hand. He continued to think about his new capabilities. The protagonist smiled slyly to himself. He could now already fulfill the role of a tank attacker and other fighters. The car and its passengers pulled into the street of the ruined city. The area was deserted. Suddenly, dangerous green mutants appeared on the city street. They lunged at the people with ravenous abandon. The tank put his shield out in front of him and started fighting off the monsters. Heck remembered that he could only pick up a limited amount of skills. The tank turned around and shouted for Lee Don Heck to support him with a long-range attack. The Don with the bow ran forward. He shouted to his friend that he understood him. The protagonist pondered the combination of his new skills. Don grabbed his battle bow and began launching arrows against the mutant. Combat arrows hit the monster and hit it. The mutant began to fall backwards. The commander turned around and ordered the girl named So Yi-jin to finish off the monster. With her battle bow in hand, she replied to the tank that she understood his instruction. The archer launched her battle arrows against the monster with a precise shot. The mutant didn't have time to dodge. Combat arrows hit and hit him dead on. The green monster was lying on the ground and showed no signs of life. The tank said cheerfully that there were still 2 mutants left. Hake was standing with a large backpack behind his back. It occurred to him to activate something for fun. The protagonist himself waved his head from side to side. He knew that once activated, he wouldn't be able to change roles for 24 hours. He remembered that he was going to register as a hunter after the hunt. He didn't need to complicate things. The fighters looked around carefully. They saw a dilapidated and devastated city. The tank shouted to the fighters that they were all well done. They had made it through another day without incident. The commander told the protagonist with the backpack that they had an unusually high amount of subs today compared to other days. Suddenly the tank heard some noise from the side. He noticed that a guy came up. A young warrior with a large backpack behind his back was very exhausted. He said he was about to die. Min looked at his friend and said that the guy next to them was known for his fists during his high school days. Tank turned around and asked his friend if he meant by school the time before the disaster. Min turned around and explained that his friend didn't even train even formally. But many athletes ended up at his feet. The protagonist glanced cheerfully at the former schoolboy and said he didn't look like a bully. Min raised his hand and said his friend used to beat up bullies and dreamed of becoming a detective. Tank thanked the protagonist for his work and handed him an envelope with payment. Hek waved his hands and arms away and said he would not charge. The commander replied to his friend to take the money and thanked him. Hek gladly took the envelope. The commander suggested to the boy that he continue to work as a porter. The protagonist smiled happily and told the commander that he would think about it. Tank turned his back and walked away. He told the guy that they could meet up later sometime. Min asked his friend if they were going to a barbecue tonight. Hake excitedly replied to his friend that he already had other plans today. He promised to treat him to meet next time. Min couldn't figure out what his friend's plans might have been. He figured Hek was going on a date. The protagonist entered a large building. It was the sole branch of the Awakened Association. He walked over to the tank rack. The employee looked at the guest in surprise. She didn't even know what to say at once. Girl asked the guest, "What did he just tell her?" The guy replied that he had come to register as an awakened person. The employee asked the guy if he had awakened like a tank. The guest answered her in the affirmative. The protagonist confidently tapped his hand on his chest and said that he had awakened like a tank today. The office worker looked silently at her interlocutor. She studied him with her gaze. The protagonist began to worry. He asked his interlocutor what was wrong with him. The startled girl raised her hand and told her guest that he was the first one awakened like a tank in the last 6 months. The girl smiled. She asked the guest if he had brought her his ID. The protagonist held out a document with his photo in his hand for the interlocutor. The employee pointed her hand in the direction. She told the guy to sit down on the bench with the other customers. Hake sat down silently and began to wait his turn. There were other people around him. The protagonist was in a complete reverie. He was immersed in himself and staring in front of him. Hake irritably put his hand on his face. He remembered that after he came back, he opened his eyes and thought he was asleep. When the main character was in prison, his brother and sister came to visit him. Then his relatives died in a car accident. Hek had waited a very long time when he learned that his brother and sister had died. The death of close relatives was a decisive event in the boy's life. He then decided to become a villain. The protagonist returned home and was surprised to find his loved ones alive. He experienced a lot of joy. Hek wrapped his arms around his brother and sister. At first he thought it was all a dream for him. The protagonist commanded himself that he would never lose his loved ones again. The guy had strictly ordered himself that he would protect his loved ones at all costs. The protagonist took a closer look at the system window. The guy studied his stamina level in the system window with great interest. The main character couldn't figure out what the core formation was. It wasn't mentioned by the GI. Hake thought thoughtfully to himself that he would know when the core was finished forming. At the side of the Chagall worker, she came up and called the protagonist by name. Hake looked at the girl with interest. He waited to see what she was going to tell him now. The employee smilingly handed the protagonist his new ID card. A guy in a white coat stood at the side. The employee handed the head hero a document and said they had finished verifying his identity. The girl asked that Hake go through with her co-worker for further testing. The guy reached out his hand to the main character with a smile and said his name, Lim Ji-hoon. The protagonist held out his hand to the employee and cheerfully called his name. Lim and Hake shook hands firmly. The protagonist prepared to walk further into the building. Lim looked at the guy and said with a smile that they had prepared everything for him. "So you can start the test right away." The protagonist entered a huge elevator with his companion. They went up in silence. Heck glanced furtively at his companion. He thought that the target wasn't an awakened one, so it couldn't be copied. The protagonist realized that the association also had an unawakened staff. Hake scrutinized his companion in the elevator. Then they arrived at the desired floor. The protagonist was lying on the couch. Lim stood next to him and said that the test consists of 3 stages. Lim explained to him that his strength and endurance would be tested first. The staff member looked at the guy carefully and said that the preparations were complete. The protagonist with electrodes on his body lay silently on the couch and looked up in front of him. Lim looked at the patient and said with a smile that everything would take about 10 minutes. The second stage was beginning. Hake stood in a tracksuit and held a wooden shield in his hands. Needed to check the use of his active unique skill. Hake stood with shield in hand. He saw the stuffed green monster in front of him. The protagonist, shield in hand, marched forward against the stuffed monster. The scientists were watching him from the laboratory window. Lim commanded into the microphone that he needed to check the aggression level. Hek should use the skill on the dummy in front of him to do so. Hake put it in front of him and ran forward to attack the mutant. Lim shouted to the guy to feel free. He could attack any part of the mannequin. Hake swung his shield around and slammed it down on the dummy's head with all his might. The scientists kept a close eye on the guy. Then the final stage of the evaluation stage began. After much testing, Lim walked up to the protagonist and brought him a cup of drink. Hake looked intently at the cup in the employee's hands. There was hot coffee inside. Lim looked at the guy and informed him that the selection of appraisers would take place in 2 days. The protagonist stretched his palms forward and asked if the tests were over. Lim replied to the interlocutor that all tests were over for today. Lim told his interlocutor with a smile that he could go to the counter. There he would be given basic equipment. Hek told himself happily that he would be getting the association's standard gear. The guy sat down on a chair and said excitedly that he was worried about the decrease in the number of awakened tanks and healers. Their numbers had dropped a lot. The protagonist consumed his coffee with appetite and looked at his interlocutor with interest. Lim said in a thoughtful voice that most of the forcibly coerced focus on attack or support roles. The guy informed in a thoughtful voice that it wasn't easy at all to get awakening stones. Tank and healer awakening stones were very rare. Hake thought with excitement that even with the awakening stone, there was no absolute guarantee that one would awaken. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor carefully. He remembered that after he became a villain, he could no longer register as an awakened one. Lim explained to the guy that he hadn't met a tank in a long time, so he was very excited. He's not usually this talkative. The protagonist got to his feet and told his interlocutor in a soothing tone that everything was fine. Lim explained that the third step of the evaluation is scheduled in 2 days. The employee extended his hand to the protagonist and explained that he would get the exact time in a message tomorrow. Hake fell silent. He looked at the boy's hand with interest and answered him nothing. Suddenly, the protagonist smiled very cheerfully at the scientist. Hek extended his hand to his interlocutor and said with a smile that he looked forward to working together. The main character was on a city street in Ilchiro. There were many people walking around the buildings. Hek was walking and holding a phone in his hand. He was carrying a huge metal suitcase. The protagonist called his friend and asked if he could talk now. Hek happily informed a surprised friend on the phone that he had awakened like a tank on the way home. Min was very surprised. He didn't believe the main character's words. Hek was standing outside a large building at this time. After a short pause, Min asked his friend, "Was he kidding now?" Hek went inside the building and told a friend on the phone that he wouldn't joke about such a thing. Inside the store, the bell rang after the protagonist opened the door. Hek saw a bunch of employees inside the store. He realized this was the right place. Min still couldn't believe his friend had awakened as a tank. The protagonist replied to his friend that all his words were true. He was walking through the store in the direction of the storefront. Min told the person on the phone that they had separated only a couple of hours ago. Hek saw an artifact hanging from the ceiling in front of him. Min said with surprise that the protagonist had awakened with a tank. Hek was silent in response, and his friend thought the call had been interrupted. The protagonist saw a model of the mantis's front leg for 3,000,000 won in a store. He was surprised at the price. Hek explained to the person on the phone that the connection had been interrupted for a second. He told his friend that today he went to the association and registered as an awakened. In 2 days, he would have a test for a third-ranked tank. The protagonist stood near the counter and looked at the artifacts. He told a friend that it might help him to watch veteran hunters while hunting. Hek asked his friend if he could join him as a porter again. He replied that he had already seen enough work today. The protagonist was examining things on the counter. He informed a friend that he was very focused on carrying things. He didn't see enough of the commander's fight. Suddenly the boy looked at the counter with joy. He saw the right thing. The protagonist saw the wooden bracelet lying there. The mind told him over the phone that he would tell the situation to the commander and get back to him. Customer approached the salesman at the counter. He said he wanted to bring his bracelet and solution with him. Hake scrutinized the wooden bracelet. This artifact was once possessed by Jidan Russell. This villain had a rank 3. The main character recalled sitting in a restaurant with a fellow fighter and having a drink with him. The fighter with the bottle had a brightly colored bracelet on his arm. Hek remembered that he had an 8th rank among the villains before returning in time. Hek once had a drink with Jaden. That's when the bad guy told him the details of the bracelet and its main functions. The salesman looked at the customer for a long time and did not answer anything to his request. Hake thought to himself that with the bracelet he could increase the effectiveness of his skills by 30%. The protagonist asked the salesman unhappily, "Why is he already looking at him like that?" The worker asked the client in a calm voice if the client had registered as an awakened person today. Hek replied that he had already registered. The salesman suddenly swung his arm against him. The protagonist fearfully stretched his arm out in front of him. The salesman told him in a cheerful voice that he knew it. The employee held his fist in front of him. He said with a smile that he was also an awakened with teleportation ability. The protagonist looked at his interlocutor and said that he understood everything. At first he thought that the salesman wanted to attack him with his fist. Hake extended his fist forward and bumped it against the salesman's fist. An employee of Huang Mansu came from the side and extended his hand forward. He had the ability to manipulate space. Hek looked at the mana happily and said he was glad to meet him. The salesman asked the protagonist if he was a tank if he took such a test. The worker said cheerfully that tanks are nobility among the awakened. Hek inquired the storewakes, "Do they really do part-time work here?" Both employees behind the counter answered at the same time that this was their main job. Hek was very surprised by this answer. The salesman explained in a disgruntled voice that he had not had an easy time finding work. His ability was not particularly useful in fights. Man said with a smile that he became an antique store owner to earn money. The salesman put a small vial on the counter. He said that the total price for everything would be 300,000. The protagonist thought that workers. Now it was hard on the labor market. Hak looked at the items on the counter and thanked the vendors. He gathered all the materials he needed for printing. The guy looked at the wooden bracelet and the vial. He had more crystals at home. His blood should be needed as a binder for all of it. The bracelet glowed in the hands of its new owner. The boy was glad that the artifact was finally in his possession. Hake looked at the jewelry on his hand. It was a twilight bracelet. The system informed the surprised host that it had printed an important artifact. The protagonist learned that the twilight bracelet had been registered as an artifact in the system. Hek was able to see the options of the registered artifact. The system informed the new owner that the item was fully unlocked. Hake turned to the side and asked, "Was it really an artifact from the original system's master?" The protagonist glanced at his phone and noticed that a friend of Kan's had called him. Hek looked at the table where his phone lay. He said in a calm voice that his friend had scared him. The protagonist picked up the phone and greeted Min. Min said on the phone he explained to his commander about the protagonist. Hek heard that no matter how many minds explained to his commander, the leader replied that it was all nonsense and made no sense. Min told his friend that his commander would believe him only if he saw it all with his own eyes. The protagonist was very happy. A friend in a cheery voice called the protagonist simple over the phone. Hek opened a spatial manipulation near him. Min told his friend to come to the 7th gate tomorrow morning. Hek stuck his hand in the portal. The protagonist took the suitcase in his hands. He told his interlocutor that he understood everything. Min said goodbye to his friend until tomorrow. The next day, the protagonist arrived on the street in the morning. There were soldiers in uniform standing near the car. He greeted them. Tank and Mines were very much startled and surprised when they saw the protagonist in front of them. Hek stood in the middle of the street wearing a brown battlesuit. He held his shield in his hand. Min pointed a finger at his friend and said excitedly that the suit suited him. The fighter was pleased to tell the protagonist that he had indeed awakened like a tank. The flustered Tank turned to his friend and wondered what had even happened during the day. Tank told his friends in a joyful voice that he had awakened unexpectedly yesterday on his way home. Tank told his friend with a smile that the numbers of natural awakenings had dropped lately. That impressed him. The protagonist told his friend that he has a test tomorrow for a 3rd-rank tank. He came today to watch the others command and fight. This should all help him. Tank thoughtfully told the guy that he wasn't sure if he could learn anything from him. The fighter turned around and told the guy he only wanted to give him one piece of advice. The guy was holding the shield in front of him. He told the main character that he wasn't wearing it because he was awakened by the tank. The tank informed in a serious voice that he was wearing a shield, as it was all his choice. A fighter told a friend that comes at a moment when he will be tired, worn out. At that moment, you need to remember the important words. Heck was very interested. He looked at his interlocutor with great attention. The tank explained to his friend that he wouldn't be able to get back in line due to skills or stats. The guy could only be helped by his determination. After a brief meeting, the men set out on a mission into the city. The whole area was deserted. In the center of the town square, a huge demonic predator lay sleeping. The tank looked out from around the corner at the predator. He asked his colleague if that type of prey had identified the location. The fighter replied that they had confirmed a single trout. The tank was standing near the corner of the building. He told the comms caller that it was time to start. The commander turned around and told the fighter named Zhang Dejin to check the location of the monsters once more. The light-haired Zhang looked at the commander and said that he understood. The tank activated a three-dimensional map of the neighborhood. He studied it carefully. The fighter looked carefully at the map and reported that the type of monster had been confirmed. The tank showed his subordinate carefully at the map. He told which buildings contained the monsters and cowards. The mines were studying the map together with the main character. The commander told me that the defense of the corpuscles was high, like E-class monsters. Min told his friend that he didn't know if they had enough power for the chicks. The fighter said in a disgruntled voice that he felt exhausted. But they hadn't even started yet. He inquired about the time to penetrate the shields. The guy in the hat said in a frightened voice that at a short distance, if something happened to them, even the cowards might run at them. The commander sternly told his subordinates that there was such a possibility. He reminded them that their prey was not turnable. Hen Sun Nam's group is the most experienced veteran team in the field. The healer with a smile told her co-workers that the cowards have low attack power. She'll have an easy day. Tank asked Ji Chul's subordinate if he had set all the traps. The guy replied that everything was ready. The commander told two men to follow him. The rest of us are to stay where we are. The main character told the commander he understood everything. There was a girl standing next to him. A group of fighters were slowly advancing down the street towards the sleeping monster. The tank was walking in front and holding a shield in his hands. The protagonist began to suspect that something was wrong around him. He remembered that Chulman's team had been wiped out because of another monster's invasion. People were standing outside near the sleeping mutant. Heck thought persistently about the reasons for the destruction of Hen and his team. The protagonist scrutinized the deserted houses. He listened. Hake looked at the empty house. He still thought there was something wrong around him. The commander turned around and asked the girl Soz if she was ready. He received an affirmative answer. The commander turned around and commanded his subordinates to open fire, and launched a swarm of arrows at the standing mutant. They all hit the target. A whole bunch of arrows hit the mutant's body after flying, but didn't do much damage. With interest, she glanced in front of her and noticed that all of her arrows had hit their target. The girl informed the commander that she had hit the trout and was moving on to the next point. Tank said in a disgruntled voice that it was expected. The ravenous corpse suddenly came to his senses. His eyes lit up brightly and he jumped to his feet. The commander shouted that the monster was coming. He demanded that the ranged attackers get ready. The mines, along with his friend, replied to the commander that they were fully prepared. Suddenly the mutant jumped up on its hind legs and screamed very loudly. The archer grabbed a whole armful of arrows and launched them at the monster through his bow. A huge number of arrows flew over and all hit the target accurately. The evil mutant was very angry. He yelled very menacingly at the man. The archer was pleased with his hit. The commander told the men to keep the same distance. The fighter suddenly jumped forward and shouted that he should attack early and should keep his distance. The monster became very angry when he saw the man in front of him. He growled menacingly at him. The archer pulled out arrows and started shooting further. He yelled that he wanted to end it all and go home. The moth screamed very angrily. The arrows hit his paw after flying. The archer was jumping from side to side and firing at the mutant. The commander shouted to him over the radio and demanded that he drain him. The fighter said in a confident voice that his opponent was very slow and would not be able to hit him. He looked up at the mutant fearfully from below. The monster swung its paws viciously and managed to knock the man over the top. The fighter flew far to the side and banged into the wall after a very powerful blow from the corpse. Don could not stop his flight in any way and flew at high speed before hitting the wall. Min was very scared for his friend. He turned around and called his name. The guy with the big blade walked forward towards the monster with a confident stride. He shouted in an angry voice that he was coming in too. Min decided to try and attack the dangerous monster from above. He lunged at it with his blade. The guy, after a very powerful swing, thrust the blade into the mutant's body. The corpse turned around and looked angrily at the man. He screamed very loudly. Min bounced back from the corpse. He shouted fearfully that the monster had a very powerful shield. The mutant turned sideways very quickly and ran towards the man near the building. The huge monster swung his paw around to nail the guy. Don was very frightened. He covered himself with his arm to protect himself from the mutant. A tank came from the side. He decided to try and stop the mutant with his shield. The mutant shouted angrily as the shield from the man knocked him sideways on the head with all his might. The tank's attack was very effective. The corpse fell dead to the ground. The commander was silent. He looked angrily at the lying monster and said nothing. In a square in the midst of a ruined city, warriors tried to kill a dangerous monster. The mutant found his strength and jumped to his feet. He looked at the humans with burning eyes. The commander stood with his shield in front of the corpse. He told his subordinates that he would provoke the mutant into attacking him. The others were to prepare for melee attacks. The tank activated his suppression skill. A small fog appeared around him. The angry monster stood in front of the man with the shield. A dense fog continued to swirl around them. The fighter rejoiced. He looked at the monster and realized that he was able to provoke it. The mutant was angry. He shouted angrily at the man and swung his paw. The tank put up a shield in front of him to protect himself from the monster's attack. The mutant raised both hands up and immediately prepared to knock the man. The Dawn turned around and shouted to the Showgirl to start acting now. The rooftop archer drew her weapon and prepared to confidently fire at the mutant, and fired a bunch of arrows from the roof at the mutant on Earth. A whole set of arrows after flying hit the mutant's head. He screamed very angrily. The monster roared angrily. He decided to close himself off from the humans and sit in a protective posture. The mutant curled up in a protective posture. He was protected on all sides by his shell. The commander was gradually approaching the corpse. He shouted for the mines to use a ranged attack. The fighter turned around and shouted to the commander that he would do just that. The guy along with the commander ran up to the mutant from both sides and prepared to attack it. The tank was crushing the monster with all his might with his shield. He shouted for his fighters to make base attacks until the next command. Min stood and stared at the mutant's back. He told himself that looking at the monster was tiring him. The protagonist came up from the side and watched intently as his friends finished off the mutant. The girl turned around unhappily and said that was the end of today's hunt. She didn't understand why this always happened to them. Hake looked questioningly at his companion. The companion explained that the chickadee was very rare. The girl explained to the main character that this happens to her a couple times a year. Hek asked her interlocutor how many times she had killed. The girl explained that this was the third time their group had encountered chickadees in the last 5 months. The girl looked at the protagonist and said that he was very eager to learn something new. The companion held out a small device in her hand for the protagonist. The guy realized he was seeing M7 in front of him. The girl said that she offers the guy a measuring device called M7. The conversationalist explained to the guy with a smile that he was here to watch them hunt before his next test. Hek put a measuring device on his head. His companion explained to him that the M7 machine would help him analyze his stats. Hake looked through the device at the mutant. The girl explained that the corpse's health was 30,000 and the shield 150,000. The interlocutor said in a disgruntled voice that 30,000 health was a lot compared to most monsters. The protagonist wistfully said it would take forever to break it all down. Zhang looked at the three-dimensional map. He shouted to his friends that they had a problem. Tank turned around and asked his friend, "What's their problem?" Zhang explained that the life signals of the 4 team members were missing from the map. The commander said fearfully that the Sun Nama's group had been destroyed. The protagonist stood at the side and watched everything carefully. Hake turned to the side and shrieked, "The other fighters' stats were gone!" The protagonist glanced carefully to the sides and noticed one of the deserted houses shuddering to the ground. The shaking in the building became more and more violent. Suddenly, at one point, a large breach appeared in the wall. A creepy monster with burning eyes appeared in a hole in the building. Someone shouted that mantises were coming here. The main character looked with great consternation at the huge predatory praying mantis in the street. He realized it was all bad. The mutant with large claws continued walking towards the humans. One of the fighters shouted that they had a couple minutes left at most. Zhang was very scared. He shouted to his friends that the monsters might appear even earlier. The tank commanded the men to stand aside and wait somewhere safe. The protagonist was scared and angry. The commander shouted to his subordinates to hold their positions and prepare binding traps. Hek realized there wasn't much time left and they needed to act. He grabbed the girl's arm. The protagonist looked at his companion excitedly and explained that they needed to leave. The girl was very scared. She looked at the guy and said she agreed with him. The commander with the shield stood next to the mutant. He glared angrily at the fighters and asked where they were going. Heck shouted to the tank that at this distance, there was no way to retreat. If the monster caught them, it would tear them to shreds. The commander turned around and angrily reminded his subordinates to retreat. Hake stood and held his shield in front of him. He explained to the commander that there was no retreat. Mantises are very fast. They would still need 30 minutes to deal with the chickadee. The commander hesitated. The protagonist explained to him that the mantis could appear right now. Heck put his shield out in front of him. He said fearfully, "They could all be destroyed now." The mutant wasted no time. He accelerated and lunged at the man. The mantis swung its claws to strike the protagonist from above. Hake saw the burning eyes of the predator in front of him. He wasn't going to back down. The protagonist put his shield out in front of him and said with excitement that they needed to hold out as long as possible. The protagonist and his men were in the center of a deserted city. Tank was displeased with the actions of the protagonist. He shouted that the guy was crazy. Heck held his shield in front of him and answered him nothing. The protagonist stood with his shield in front of the monster with burning eyes. The commander shouted to him that he was just a rookie. The tank shouted that a novice without any experience was recklessly attacking a praying mantis. The green monster swung its claws around and confidently knocked the man over the top. The protagonist was able to defend himself from an enemy attack with his shield. Min was very scared for his friend. He called him by name. The main character shouted to his friends that he would still go to the battlefield after he got the card. Heck stood and defended himself with his shield. He yelled that the tanks should still take the hit. The protagonist waited for the right moment. He took off abruptly from his seat and ran forward. Hake tensed up with all his might and used a shield strike against the mantis. The commander and the fighter watched the protagonist closely. Heck explained that he needed to learn as much as possible beforehand. This would help him avoid mistakes in real fights. Min shouted angrily to the protagonist that this is the real fight. A huge monster came sideways toward the humans. They didn't see it. The main character shouted to his friends that they should worry about something else now. The tank along with the fighter turned to the side and saw the mutant. The protagonist shouted that Sanjin must keep the corpse in this passage. The monster screamed very menacingly. He decided that now he could finish off the humans. The corpse raised its paws up and prepared to nail the commander with the shield. The monster swung his huge paws around and began to attack the people below him. The tank was fending off the monster's attack. He turned around and told the fighters to rush to the protagonist's aid. They needed to buy some time. The Don ran and shouted as he ran that he had figured it out. Heck stood with his shield in front of the mantis. Tank shouted to the guy next to him to stay close against the trudge. The mutant shouted very menacingly and knocked the man with all his might with his paws from above. The tank, after a powerful blow from the monster, flew sideways and rolled on the ground. He dropped his shield. The commander, lying on the ground, shouted for Can to use a binding trap on the trout. Can was focused. He shouted back to the tank that he would do it this way. The fighter launched a small ball. The trap rolled straight toward the monster on the ground. The trap opened and chains flew out. They shackled the mutant by the leg. The monster got very angry. He couldn't free his leg. Can yelled that the binding would last 5 minutes. The tank was on one knee. He realized fearfully that they were surrounded by monsters and the escape route was already blocked. The main character waved his shield and shielded himself from the mantis. Behind him stood an archer. The tank looked at the fighters and decided that the situation was still hopeless. Hake held his shield in front of him and continued to defend himself against the monster. The Don realized it was his time to attack. He launched arrows against the mantis. A few arrows after a quick flight flew in and hit the monster. The mantis stepped forward at the man. The protagonist swung his shield to the side. The predator glared viciously at the protagonist with burning eyes and prepared to attack. Suddenly, someone attacked the mantis from the side. Many arrows flew into its head. The Hake was very surprised by this unexpected attack. The Don on the comms thanked the girl for the great shot. Sos grudgingly asked her friend who he thought she was. The monster turned his head sharply to the side and looked at the building. He saw the girl in the window. Mantis jumped up sharply on his hind legs. He prepared to turn around and run for home. The monster abruptly ran and started climbing the wall of the building. The main character shouted to the girl to run away quickly. Sos was very frightened. She realized that she had fallen into a very complicated trap. She watched with consternation through the window as the monster lumbered along the wall. Stones poured from the top of the room. They knocked the girl to the floor. She dropped her weapon. Don was very frightened. He kept shooting his bow and called his girlfriend by name. The arrows from the bow flew into the body of the mantis and flew away from it to the side. They could not penetrate it. Don was very angry. He realized that his weapons were powerless against the monster. The girl was standing next to the protagonist. She asked him excitedly, how could she help? A bracelet glowed on the guy's arm. He thought hastily about the provocation against the mutant not growing in a straight line. The protagonist glanced at his glowing bracelet. His double shield strike wasn't enough to keep the monster's attention on him. The master commanded for the stats to open. He was frightened, thinking that Mantis might lunge at the girl. The protagonist scrutinized the system window. He noticed a set of artifacts. Without wasting any time, the protagonist activated his suppression skill. Everything around was covered with a very dark blue mist. Heck, with his shield, stood next to his companion. Mantis glared angrily at the girl through the window. He prepared to climb inside the room. The wounded archer was sitting against the wall. There was stone rubble all around her. The main character ordered her telepathically to go back. The green predator with burning eyes prepared to lunge at its victim in the building. The mantis was climbing the wall of the building to get to its victim. The protagonist was standing on the ground next to his girlfriend. The girl was very frightened. She said to herself in a quiet voice that she didn't want to just stand there any longer. Hake continued to stand and hold his shield in his hand. His companion abruptly turned and ran to the side. The protagonist called out the girl's name. He took a closer look and was pleased to note that his plan had worked. Heck yelled to the girl inside the building to get out of there as soon as possible. The mantis kept climbing the wall of the house. He tried to climb through the girl's window. The protagonist yelled that he had now directed the monster's attention to himself. The commander interrogated the guy. Did he return the monster's focus to himself? Heck consisted with the shield against the mantis. The protagonist abruptly snapped out of his seat and ran with his shield against the mutant. Heck tapped the monster with his shield on its paw. He thought it was very risky to maintain the provocation with only basic attacks. Hake thought he had no more choice. He used the destructive body skill. The system asked for confirmation from the host. The main character commanded confirmation. Hake continued to wave his shield in front of the monster to keep its attention. The protagonist equipped the passive attacker skill. He bounced back from a blow from a mantis claw. Hake crouched on the ground in a fighting stance. His basic attacks became the same in damage as his attacking attacks. There was a new sensation in the main character's body. He used to have this feeling before the time reversal. Don grabbed his bow and started mass attacking with the monster's pry bar. Arrows flew at the mantis and flew off to the side. Heck remembered that such a feeling earned him the 8th rank among villains. Hak went into a fighting stance and shielded himself. He activated hypervision. The protagonist swung around and knocked the mantis with maximum force with his shield. The monster's impenetrable body began to malfunction. It developed cracks. She was in one of the rooms in the big building. The girl grabbed an arrow and wanted to try and launch it from the bow. The archer didn't have the strength to shoot any further. She dropped the arrow to the floor. She had lost a lot of blood and could no longer use her strength to fire the bow. At this time, a girl came up from the side and began healing the archer with green magic. Sue shouted fearfully to the archer not to scream. It was all very distracting. So turned around and told the girl not to do something that wasn't necessary. She advised that it would be better to treat the hake. Sue held her hand in front of her and continued to treat the wounded. She told Sabrani not to worry about the protagonist. Sue looked out of the window fearfully. She said that the main character was taking all the damage as if he was the head of their team. The girl looked at the main character from the window and said he was even amazing. Heck, at this time, he was running and attacking a mantis with his shield. The mines, along with the tank, stood and tried to fend off the chickadee's attack. The monster stood angrily on its hind legs and screamed very loudly. The tank shouted that their shield wouldn't last long. The commander fearfully told the guy that they needed to finish before the trap stopped working. There was an evil mutant standing in front of them. The tank shouted to the fighter that he would keep the monster's attention on him at all costs. So the mines must follow his instructions. The monster raised both paws up and prepared to pound the humans overhead with them. The tank felt a great excitement. He said that he had been waiting for such an attack for a very long time. He covered his body with his shield. The commander decided not to stand still. He rushed forward at the mutant with his shield. The tank decided to use his skill called Shield Strike against the mutant. The binding trap was already finishing its effect. The commander turned around and shouted to the fighter to start acting now. The Min was holding a huge blade. He swung it around to kill the corpse. The fighter activated the system and turned on critical strike for himself. Min managed to slash the monster's body from top to bottom. He waited for the evil mutant to explode now. The body of the corpse began to break apart and fall into small particles. The overjoyed fighter realized that his skill had worked. The commander shouted to his subordinate that this was the final blow. The deed was done. The monster completely shattered. The guy saw a rock and a small piece of paper in front of him on Earth. Min rejoiced. He realized that he had gotten a core and also a skill card for killing the corpse. He held the treasure in his hands. The commander angrily ordered his subordinate to hurry to the aid of the protagonist. Hake continued to swing his sword in all directions and attack the mantis. Wounds appeared on the mutant's body. The main character looked at the mutant in surprise. He was surprised by his wounds with green blood. Hek put his shield above his head. He shouted to his friends to take his monster on. Min wondered. He didn't understand why on Earth the main character wanted them to take his mantis for themselves. Hake stood in a fighting stance. The commander told him to treat his battle as a practical experience and finish the monster himself. Heck, Mahal swung his shield in all directions. He didn't see how he could finish the mantis himself. So said in a disgruntled voice that she had an objection. She didn't want to live being in debt. The sap was in the window of the building. She grabbed a bow and launched many mantis arrows from it. The monster was very badly wounded by the arrows. Green blood spurted from its body. The protagonist rushed into the final attack with his shield to finish off the mantis. Hake timed his attack very precisely. He smashed the monster's head from above with his shield. The mantis's head was chopped off. The protagonist stabbed it with a metal shield. The commander, looking in front of him, turned to his fighter. Min immediately answered him. Tank looked in front of him and saw the metal shield in the mantis's head. He turned to the mine about his friend. Hake stood silent on the earth with his weapon in his hands. He was covered in green blood. The commander asked the fighter, was it the tank that the protagonist awakened? Late one night in a deserted town, the warriors decided to load up in a car and drive away. There was a truck with the back of the truck open in the street. The commander told the soldiers to hurry up to leave. The tank told his subordinates to hurry up. If they were late, more monsters might appear. The protagonist stood beside the car and wiped his shield clean of green blood. Min came up from the side. He asked the guy, did he use the thing? Heck asked his friend, what thing did he say? Min took his blade. He explained to the guy what he said about hypervigilance. The protagonist was silent in response. The fighter told his friend that otherwise his past movement had no meaning. Min turned and reminded his friend that using this ability for him used to give him a headache for the day. Heck put his shield on the back. He said he was doing fine so far. His friend told him that he was jealous of him. The protagonist looked at his phone with great interest. Min reminded his friend that he was buying him a drink tonight. Heck called home. He explained to his friend that today he needed to spend time with his brother and sister. A tank came up from the side. He asked the guy angrily, did he really just wake up yesterday? The commander didn't believe a rookie could fight as well as the protagonist. Heck turned around and told the commander that everything was just like that. The tank asked him what exactly everything was just like that. Min twisted his head from side to side. He looked at the protagonist and commander. Heck decided to justify himself. He said he unknowingly released some supernatural power. Tank walked up to the guy and told him sternly that he wouldn't believe such a thing. The protagonist fell silent. He looked at his interlocutor and answered him nothing. The commander stood next to his subordinates. He shouted to them that he had something to tell them all. Tank sternly said that Hake had struck the mantis. But it hadn't been officially registered as awakened yet. The commander glared angrily at the fighters and explained that circumstances had left them no other choice. He added that they could all face the consequences of Heck's battle before he registered. Heck looked at the commander carefully. He realized that he had almost been the villain again. The tank explained to the fighters that they should keep today's incident between them. Sue smiled happily. She liked the commander's words and his suggestion. Dawn told the commander cheerfully that they understood everything perfectly. There was no need to worry about them. Another fighter promised that they would take everything to the grave with them. The commander in the combat suit, without turning around, thanked the protagonist. Hake was very surprised to hear such unexpected words from the tank. The commander explained to the protagonist that thanks to him, they were all saved today. Tank explained to the protagonist that he would now include him in the profit sharing. The main character said that because of him, now the others will get a smaller share. Sue walked up to the guy and replied that that was correct, but no one would complain. The main character looked at the girl with a long look. He called her by name. Heck turned to the fighters and said that if any of them had anything to say, they should let him know. Sue gave the protagonist a sly look and said that she would just stop treating the fighters. A guy's phone rang. He excitedly told the girl he had to answer it. Sue asked who was calling him. The protagonist explained with a smile that he was getting calls from relatives back home. The guy looked closely at his phone and saw that he had an incoming call from the association. Heck stared at his phone in surprise. He didn't understand why the association was calling him now. The main character arrived at a large office building in the evening. It was very brightly lit and stood out. Heck was inside the building. He was very unhappily surprised when he learned that his test had been rescheduled. Lim tried to calm the fighter down. He told him that the hunters from Thailand were returning today. Heck grudgingly asked what the return of the hunters had to do with his test. The employee said that hunters from various Asian countries had been sent to Bangkok against the monsters. Lim said that hunters from Korea ranked third in Asia. In this mission, Korea contributed more than other countries. The association is focusing on this. The protagonist looked away silently. The words of his interlocutor were clear to him. Heck quickly realized that the members of the association wanted to get rid of him as soon as possible. The protagonist turned his head and told the employee that he understood everything and it was already safe to start. Heck stood with his shield. The test was to be in the form of a virtual battle. The protagonist saw a virtual hologram on the floor. It looked like the simulation room he was in before the rollback. Lim informs the guy through the microphone that he will be fighting against the monster Xeris for an hour. The protagonist must give his best. The worker turned around and said that the preparation was finished. Some people came into the room. The man along with the woman and the boy looked at the researcher carefully. They were silent. Lim looked anxiously at the judges and asked if they could start already. The man waved his head and gestured that it was okay to start. The staff member turned around in an excited voice and shouted that he had figured it out. The judges were standing behind him and watching everything. Lim shouted to the main character that the test was starting. Heck, at this time, he put his shield out in front of him. A huge monster appeared in the room. It didn't take long for him to rush in and use his hands to attack the man. Heck put up his shield to stop the mutant's attack. He realized that the top hunters had come to this place now. The protagonist activated a skill called Shield Strike. He fought off a mutant. The monster flew off to the side of the room after a very hard blow from the man. The protagonist stood in a fighting pose. He thought that he could use such an opportunity to copy someone regardless of their class. The mutant gave the man a very angry look and prepared to lunge at him. Heck glared angrily at the monster. He thought that if he did the right thing, he could rake in the jackpot. The monster snapped angrily and ran at the guy. Heck, at the last moment, he thought he should just take the test now. Heck was focused and held his shield in front of him. He was impressed by the heightened sense of the large monster Xeris. The guy shielded himself from the monster's attack. He figured the average hunting time was 4 hours. Heck ducked his head to the side from the mutant's blow. He thought that his very successful results might arouse suspicion on the part of the association. Heck put his shield out in front of him. He did all the moves according to the textbook. The protagonist was fighting off a mutant attack. He needed to maintain tempo so no one would suspect him. 3 hours later, the guy was still confidently fending off the mutant attack. Lim followed the battle closely on the video broadcast. He was surprised that the guy had been repeating the moves for all 3 hours. Lim was scared because a contestant might fail the test. He was worried about the judges' reactions. The worker turned around and noticed that the judges were looking into the monitors with great interest. The man cheerfully said they could witness the birth of a super new baby. The woman said the guy attacks and backs off when he needs to. He has a steady level of aggression on himself. The guy corrected his glasses and said the contestant deflects attacks with minimal movement for 3 hours. The woman excitedly told her companions that she was stepping away to the restroom and would return shortly. The guy looked behind the woman with great suspicion. He didn't believe her. Suddenly the man put his hand on his stomach and said he had to go to the bathroom. The guy with glasses followed the man in silence. He didn't believe his words. The guest with glasses was following the protagonist and said that the contestant was very swivel-eyed, like a little rat. The guy took off his glasses and said it would be pointless to continue the test any further. Lim looked at his interlocutor and asked fearfully if he thought so. The guest didn't answer anything. His phone rang and he slipped his hand into his jacket. The guy with the phone in his hand explained to the employee that he was going to step away for a moment. Woman on the phone. She was on the phone. She was talking to someone about the potential of a test taker. A man was standing by the stairs. He was on the phone telling me the test taker was amazing. The man told the interviewer that the movements were, according to the master, as in the textbook, the most difficult. The protagonist stood with a shield in the test room. People kept following him. The guy excitedly reported over the phone that the person in the room was the textbook. The protagonist held his shield in front of him and defended himself against another attack. Heck dodged another blow from the monster and covered himself with his shield. The judges watched him and discussed his skills. Heck closed with his shield. At the side, one of the judges said to do his best to keep everyone else from doing anything. The main character finished the test. The girl handed him a document with his picture on it. The worker informed the participant that he or she had received an awakened registration card. Heck fell silent. He was studying the document with his picture on it very carefully. The employee told the guy that it's very rare to get an S grade when first waking up. Heck couldn't figure out what was up with the S grade. The girl smiled at the guy and repeated that it was very rare who gets an S grade on first awakening. Heck looked questioningly at the employee. He didn't understand what her words meant. The worker explained to the protagonist that participants usually get an E or F grade. The guy turned around toward the exit. He figured he wasn't doing anything special, just fighting and conserving his strength. Hake smiled to himself and realized that registration was over for him. The guy looked at his hand and thought he would be doing legitimate things and living with his brother and sister. The main edge heard some noise in the street. A passerby was yelling to Yoon-ho that he loved her. There was a big crowd outside. The police were helping the girl inside. There were a lot of fans around. Someone was calling out for Ji-eun. Through the doors, guests entered the room. The protagonist thought they were some hunters from the mission in Thailand. A sorceress named Kanji was ranked second in the national attacker rankings. A hunter named Kim Yoon-ho. He was ranked number 1 in the National Offensive Player of the Year. A fighter named Lee Dae-soo led the nation in tank rankings. The protagonist glanced sideways at the hunter and noticed that he looked very displeased. Hake remembered that the hunter was known for his bad temper. He decided to talk to him. The protagonist smiled to himself and said he could do it. The hunters stopped. They looked at the boy carefully and silently, the main character in a very timid voice to greet the fighters. He told them he was a fan. Hack told the hunters in a bolder voice that he was very glad to meet them. Khan approached the guy and said she could sign something for him. The protagonist got worried. He explained to the woman he was talking to that it wasn't about that. Heck approached a fighter named Lee and explained that he was a fan. The man became very angry when he heard such words from a stranger. Heike got really scared. He realized he had just done something wrong. Lee walked up to the guy and angrily asked him what the guy had said. Hake realized that the hunter was very angry with him. He looked at him silently and fearfully. The protagonist looked intently at the evil hunter across from him. He was surprised by the look of Lee. The hunter took his time approaching the guy. Heck realized very quickly that he was now mistaken for a villain. The protagonist was scared at the last moment. He thought the hunter wanted to hit him. Lee looked angrily at the guy and asked him again what the guy had said to him. The protagonist explained in a frightened voice to the hunter that he was a fan. The hunter was very amused. He turned to his colleagues with a smile. Ken said with excitement that the boy had succeeded. A surprised young hunter stood beside her. The main character got very excited. He turned around and looked at the woman. Ken angrily looked away and said the monkey showed up. Half an hour ago, the hunters were driving down the street in a black limo. Lee told his co-workers he had fans. The guy sat next to the woman inside the limo. He reminded the man that he had recently thrown his fan out because he found him annoying. The hunter was not happy. The woman said she never saw anyone else who would call themselves a Lee fan. Ken approached the man and said that she hadn't seen anyone like that. Khan looked away and explained to her interlocutor that she didn't like men who lie. The man menacingly told his interlocutors that his name was Lee Dae-soo. He was the most important tank in the whole country, and he must have many fans. The woman told the hunter that if he had a single fan, she would agree to have dinner with him alone. Lee was very surprised when he heard such a suggestion from a colleague. Ken explained to the man that if no one showed up, he would have to help him. Lee looked at his colleague incredulously. He didn't understand what he could help the woman with. Ken told my friends that they are planning a monster hunt with a class in Genesis, but they don't have enough tanks in the guild. The woman turned around and told the man that if he lost, he would have to be the main tank once. The hunter was very surprised when he realized that he would have to work for free if he lost. Lee was now standing and looking at the protagonist with great interest. The woman got very angry. She realized that the hunter had found a fan, and she had lost the argument. Was he excited and interested in asking the guy if he was a fan? The main character was getting more and more worried, looking at the smiling hunter. He decided he should run away already. Lee reached out his hand to the guy. The protagonist looked at him very cautiously and fearfully. Hake stood there not knowing what to do next. He was afraid to shake the man's hand. Lee explained with a smile to the guy that he couldn't sign anything for him because he didn't have a pen. He offered to just shake his hand. The Hake looked fearfully at the hunter's hand. He didn't understand what was going on here. The protagonist made up his mind and reached out to shake the hunter's hand. Hake copied all the man's skills very quickly during the handshake. The hunter asked the main character what his name was. The guy replied that his name was Jung Hek. Lee handed his new acquaintance a business card. Hake thanked him in return. A young hunter came up from the side and asked the protagonist his name again. Hek looked at his interlocutor with excitement and suspicion and wondered, why did he ask him his name? The young hunter replied that his name was Kim Yoon-ho. The main character explained that he knew his name. Hek shook hands with the young hunter. Kim said it was surprising to him. The protagonist could not understand what surprised his interlocutor. Kim marveled because he had encountered a national treasure in such a place. Lee asked with interest to his colleague why he called his fan a national treasure. Kim grabbed his colleague by the neck and said they had to go quickly. The president of the association was waiting for them. The protagonist watched from the sidelines as the old and young hunter walked away from him in an embrace. Khan gave a disgruntled look as the hunters left. She said it annoyed her. The main character rushed over to the woman and said cheerfully that he was a fan and wanted to shake her hand. Heck kept insisting on a handshake for the huntress. He said he would be honored. Khan abruptly turned away and stepped aside. She didn't say anything back. Heck thought the woman was very strange. He remembered that she had said earlier that she could sign an autograph. The protagonist turned around and headed away. He figured he'd get away sooner. The protagonist rejoiced, since he had just copied a lot of skills from the hunters. In New York, at the American Awakened Association, had workers sitting in the office. The fighter watched intently into the monitor. He asked the guy what they were looking at now. The fighter was watching the protagonist with interest. He said that the guy spent only 3% of his life force in 3 hours of training. The staff member asked what country the guy was from. The interviewee replied that Haki was from Korea. The guy reached out and picked up the phone. The interlocutor said it could all be a scam. The guy was holding the phone. He explained to the interviewer that the people in Korea didn't even know they were being followed. An employee called his coworker named Paul. The coworker was unhappy because he was distracted. The fighter suggested that his colleague study the guy before reporting to the higher-ups. The floor explained to Kevin that there are very few awakened from the rank in the world. The floor continued to ring. He told the interlocutor that they, along with other countries, are keeping a close watch on those who awaken immediately with S rank. Kevin fell silent. He was deep in thought and answered nothing to his colleague. Paul kept dialing a number on the phone. He explained that if they missed time, they could miss out on future S ranks. Paul called the supervisor and told him he had just checked a tank from Korea that had a registration from rank. The employee confirmed to the supervisor on the phone that the guy was from Korea. Kevin carefully watched the video of the main character. The floor told the director that the guy's result was incredible. The employee told his supervisor that he had to take a look. He was staring at the main character in the video. It was a bright day in the city. The main character prepared to appear on the roof of one of the buildings. A bright portal opened on the roof of the house. From there, the guy stepped onto the roof. Heck! He went to the door and grabbed the handle. For him, everything was happening as expected. The guy was coming down the stairs and looking at the system window. He thought that the passives had increased to level 3. After that, they raised the defense and lowered the damage they received. Heck read the system window detailed information about the passive skill. At this time, the tank was among the ruins and fought a dangerous monster. The red mutant with burning eyes was very dangerous. It glared predatorily at the man and growled. The tank accelerated with shield in hand and prepared to lunge at the monster. Heck at this time thought that a number of the skills with the shield could do very decent damage. The fighter hit the monster with all his might. He used shield stun against it. After the stun, the mutant's eyes went blank. The protagonist carefully read the system message about the universal skill. The tank abruptly turned around and shouted for Hunter Kim Yun-ho to start acting now. Kim held the sword in his hands. He ran sharply to the commander's aid. His unique skills didn't have any stats that would increase the power of the attacks. The hunter with the blade very bravely lunged at the monster in front of him. The horned mutant was surprised to see the man in front of him disappear very abruptly. Kim, after disappearing very abruptly and unexpectedly, appeared above the monster's head. The guy swung his blade to strike the monster. After teleporting, the first attack deals 100% critical damage. The mutant missed a very strong blow from the hunter. Bright sparks erupted from his eyes. Kim looked at the results of the attack he liked. Heck studied the details of the skill called Flash in the system window. Hake looked happily in front of him. All the information he had received interested him greatly. The protagonist was coming down the stairs. He thought joyfully that this was a real success for him. Heck stood by the intercom remote and dialed the code. He decided that he would combine the skills he had learned from Lai and Kim. The main character opened the door and stepped inside the apartment. He thought that maybe he would even be able to fight the average monsters alone. Hake went into the apartment and looked around carefully. There was no one in the kitchen. The protagonist looked away in the kitchen to find some food for himself. Hake looked over to the shelf and noticed a package of food lying there. The guy touched the box of food. He noticed that it was cold. Hake glanced unhappily in front of him. He didn't understand why the food in the kitchen was cold. The guy remembered he'd bought this food for dinner. At the side, a sissy came out of the bedroom. Hake looked questioningly at the girl in the kitchen. He studied her with his gaze. Jong looked at his brother unhappily and asked why he had come so late. The protagonist asked the girl excitedly, "Didn't she eat anything today?" Jong explained to her brother that it would be better if they all ate together. The main character sat down and reminded the girl that he told her to make sure she and her brother ate first. Jong explained back that she just didn't want to eat. The hake sat down to the girl and wondered why she didn't want to eat. Sis hugged her big brother and said she dreamed he was dead. And he wasn't answering his cell phone. Jong told her older brother that she couldn't reach him and was scared. The main character cradled his sister in his arms. He said that he had no intention of dying. The door to the room opened and Chul ran in. He greeted his older brother. The boy told the protagonist that they were really waiting for him. Hek thought to himself that he should have been more careful. Chul looked at his older brother and offered to eat chicken together. Hek looked at the guy happily and said they would eat together. He remembered that he couldn't take care of the guys because he was busy. The main character was sitting at a table with the kids. They were having dinner. Hek thought he came back for that. After dinner, the children went to their room to sleep. It was dark and deserted outside. A boy and a girl were resting on a bed. The main character was in the next room. Hek standing indoors with phone in hand taking pictures of things. There was a pile of boxes on a table nearby. There were colorful pictures on the table in front of the guy. He photographed them carefully. Hek glanced at his phone. He noticed that all the pictures were ready. Hek looked at the phone with interest. He told himself that all he had to do now was register the product and wait for a buyer. The protagonist silently and carefully looked at the colored cards on the table. Hek glanced at the table and thought that the cards called Blessing Kirin and Mountain Split were very valuable to just sell. Hek reached out his hand and touched the plate with his fingers. He wanted to acquire the Mountain Split skill. The system informed the host that it could not acquire the skill. The user's class did not match the skill type. The protagonist wanted to copy the skill, but he failed. The system reported that the target was not awakened. Hek told himself that if he couldn't copy the skill, then he was out of options. Hek suddenly heard some crackling around his head, and the system reported that the creation of a personal kernel for the user had been completed. The protagonist clutched his head with his hands. At this time, a functional core system was generated. The guy couldn't understand the sounds around him. He didn't understand the core creation. Hake held his hands to his head. He heard a very strong noise in his head and didn't know how they could get rid of it. The main character thought deeply. He had never heard of the core creation from Ji Chul. The guy made up his mind and realized that he would know exactly when the core process was complete. Suddenly the noise in the guy's head got even worse. He grabbed his head with his hands. Hake looked down at his hand. He felt the strength in his body. The surprised lad had the same feeling when he first awakened. The protagonist glanced angrily in front of him and realized that this all needed to be figured out. It was late evening outside. The dilapidated buildings were deserted. Hek was rushing inside the truck down the road. There was debris of buildings lying everywhere in the street. The protagonist activated the system to view information. He had to enter keywords. Hek continued driving the truck. He set a keyword called Original System. Such a system is divided into two parts. It has a master system and a copy master system. The protagonist stopped the truck. He got detailed data on the master system and the second system. Hek opened the door and stepped out of the cockpit. He continued to read in the system window the information on his request. The protagonist glanced sideways at the abandoned dark building. He wanted information about the Spear Master. Hek was climbing up the stairs. The system reported that the copy master could copy all abilities from the creation force. He could also combine copied skills and create new ones. The system reported that the master could copy targets including all life forms. Hek was very surprised to hear such data. It was hard for him to understand. Hake opened the door and stepped out onto the roof. He thought he could copy not only the awakened, but also the monsters. The guy looked around carefully. There were huge rocks on the roof. There was an oppressive silence all around. The protagonist told himself in a relaxed voice that he was finally there. Hake grabbed the water bottle and started drinking it. He thought the function with the information retrieval was useful. Hek thought to himself that he could only unlock such a thing after generating a core. The host commanded the system to open the status window. He began scrutinizing the information in it. Hake looked closer and noticed that there was a change in his status window as well. The guy was surprised to note that he had new characteristics. The characteristic from the Twilight Bracelet was also applied. Hek looked closely at the system window. There were detailed core specs. The protagonist learns that recharge points define an extra power. He can use it when he exhausts his main power. Hek looked at the bracelet on his arm. He thought that all of this could lead to incredible efficiency. The protagonist looked at his arm with the bracelet. It was a surprise to him that all of these characteristics belonged to the first level. Hake thought happily to himself that there was also a chance of new characteristics. The protagonist looked carefully from the roof to the street. He noticed something interesting there. Hake was very excited and interested. He ran to the edge of the roof to get a better view of what was outside. Hake looked outside in surprise and saw the dangerous monster there. The green mutant walked leisurely down the street. He looked around for prey. The protagonist activated a hologram of a virtual map of the city in front of him. Hake looked carefully at the map and noticed that there wasn't a living soul nearby. It was the perfect place for a test. The main character ran outside. It was completely silent and deserted. The mutant noticed the man beside him. He gave him a vicious and sly look. Hake stood alone in the street opposite the monster. They studied each other with glances. The mutant gave the man a very disgruntled look and began to approach him. Hake stood by himself in the middle of the street. He prepared to use his weapon against the monster. The main character said in an angry voice to activate the weapon enhancement. A list of available weapons appeared in front of him. The mutant roared angrily and headed towards the man. His speed increased. The monster ran at full speed towards the protagonist to sweep him off his feet. The protagonist summoned a long light bow to attack. Heck of a brightly colored weapon. He needed it to attack the mutant. The protagonist thought to himself, and realized why the Pa Kung Ho fighter was so strong. The mutant rushed at full speed to sweep the man off his feet. Hake happily held a battle bow in front of him. Glowing arrows flew from it. The arrows hit the monster's head at full speed. Hake held his weapon in front of him. He used rapid fire and critical shot against the mutant. The protagonist thought to himself that the core and everything else had grown to its maximum. Bright arrows hit the mutant in the head. He lunged backwards away from the man. Hake stood on the ground with a glowing bow in his hand. The monster stopped and stopped attacking. The protagonist rushed forward. He activated the weapon enhancement combat skill. The host commanded the system to switch the bow to a long sword on the fly. Hake on the move thought he had completely inherited the abilities of a Pa Kung Ho fighter. The protagonist jumped up to a great height to knock the mutant over the head with his sword. Hake thought to himself that he had become as strong as a pack warrior after inheriting his skills. The man swung as hard as he could with his sword to finish off the mutant on Earth. Hake was standing on Earth and holding a shield in his hands. Across from him lay the body of a defeated mutant. The main character raised his hand to his mouth and screamed very loudly. He stared intently in front of him. The guy picked up his phone and noted that it was now 1 hour and 20 minutes outside. Hake told himself that he needed to cut the time down to 30 minutes. The guy was standing in the street holding a shield in his hand. At that time, his cell phone rang in his hand. The protagonist was surprised to notice that he was receiving a call from the Awakened Association at this late hour. Hake was very displeased and surprised to get a call now at this hour. After a brief pause, the protagonist picked up the phone and answered it. A girl named Kim Joo-hee from the front desk greeted the guy. The protagonist answered her. She asked the guy if he was comfortable talking. He replied that he had to do something like that. She informed the interviewer that they had received an unexpected message from the secretary's office. There was a very loud roar outside. It was a mutant. The employee told the guy that the president of the association wanted to see him. Hake was surprised that the president of the association wanted to see him today. The girl asked him, when would it be more convenient for him to see her? Hake explained over the phone that it would have been more convenient for him to know the president's working hours first. Hake explained to the interlocutor that the supervisor starts work at 7 o'clock in the morning. Hake suggested that the interlocutor meet at 7. The girl was surprised to inform the lad that the clock was already showing 6 hours and 20 minutes. The monster walked confidently and viciously down the street to get to the man as soon as possible. Hake told the girl on the phone that he would be there in half an hour. That's when the mutant ran at him. Hake turned off his phone and prepared to fight off the monster as quickly as possible. The predator was rushing on the move and growling viciously. He was almost to the guy. Hake raised his shield in front of him. He activated a skill called overlapping stun. The mutant had already raised his arm up to attack the guy with all his might. Hake with his shield was rushing at full speed. He activated a flash against the monster. The protagonist jumped high up above the mutant. At this time, a bright flash clattered to the ground. Hake flew towards the monster. He touched its body with his hand instead of attacking. The system suggested the host to copy the skill of a low-class soldier of the Bargos race. The guy abruptly bounced back from the mutant and shouted that he wanted to copy the skill. The Hake landed on the ground after the jump. The system informed the host that the copy was completed. The protagonist has commanded that subspace be opened. A bright glow appeared near the guy's hand. The system reported a C-class core was detected. Hake stood and contentedly held the purple crystal in his hands. The system asked the host for confirmation to absorb an S-class core to increase the level of his own core. The crystal in the guy's hand glowed with a bright light. The system reported that it was beginning to absorb the S-class core. The main character stood in the street and spread his arms out to the side. There was a bright glow around him. Heck told himself that if he raised the core level, he could save a lot of time. The mutant abruptly snapped out of his seat and ran forward at the guy. The system informed the host that the core level had been raised. After a successful battle, the protagonist teleported to the city. Hake stepped out of the portal into the city street. It was deserted. Heck was holding the phone in his hands. At this rate, he could seriously shorten the time until his second awakening. The protagonist looked at his watch and noticed it was 5 to 7. He was on time. The guy felt hungry in his stomach. He decided to step aside. Hake glanced away. He told himself that he had overdone it and was starving. The protagonist was taking an elevator with a female employee in an office building. Hake opened the system window in front of him. He wanted to check the details of the skill he had copied from Xeris. The protagonist gained the ability to disguise himself. Low-class kin of the same race could recognize him as one of their own. Heck read the details about the new skill. Soldiers of the Burgos race could recognize it as their own and not attack it. The protagonist stepped out of the elevator with his companion. He realized that the monsters would not attack him. Hawk followed the woman down the corridor. He thought happily that he would activate the skill every time he fought alone. The secretary led the protagonist to the door and prepared to open it. The woman opened the door for the customer and said he could come in. The principal at the desk greeted the boy cheerfully. He was very happy to meet him. Hake told the man in a shy voice that he too was pleased to meet him. The principal pointed to a chair for the guy and told him he could come in and have a seat. The man told the guy with a smile that he would address him as you. The protagonist explained to the principal with a smile that it was all normal. The man told the main character that he came very early and was a diligent young man. Heck explained to the principal that he had to make breakfast for his brother and sister. The man was very surprised when he heard such words from the boy. Heck said that he also had to take the boys to the department store in the afternoon. There was a long pause in the office. Heck sat beside the desk opposite the man and remained silent. Suddenly, the principal laughed very loudly. He didn't believe the main character's words. The man said with a smile that young people nowadays have a great sense of humor. The principal told the guy they needed to get right to the point. He had a proposal from the association. Hake fell silent. He was alert and listening intently to the man's words. The director explained to the guest that the association has an app for him. The man informed the guy that he could stay in Korea and say no to other foreign guilds. Suggestions interested the protagonist, but he showed no emotion. Heck told the director that he had not received any offers from foreign guilds. The director sat in his chair and said that several major guilds in the US wanted to recruit the guy. Heck was surprised to hear that guilds from the US were interested in him. The director told the guy that foreigners were interested in him after watching the duck test footage. Heck explained that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. No one could be sure of his class. The protagonist spread his arms out to the sides. He was surprised that the largest guilds in the United States were interested in him. Heck asked the man, "Is the S-class really that impressive?" He himself was a man who had only awakened once. The director informed the guest that people get an S grade after the second awakening. The man cheerfully told the protagonist that he could be ranked among those who had passed the second awakening. Hake looked at the director in silence. He pondered his words about waking up. The man said excitedly to the boy that he would maximize his performance in the second awakening. Heck realized that in his second awakening he would equal those who had awakened 3 times. He has the opportunity to reach grade S. The doors opened and a secretary appeared on the doorstep with documents. The director told the guy that he was highly valued even without achieving S-class. Heck reached out and took the papers from the secretary's hands. The man told his guest that they could not afford to lose a bird of such flight. The director accepted the documents from the woman's hands and decided to sound out a proposal for the protagonist. Heck read the documents carefully. He was to receive an initial payment of 1 billion won. His team was also exempt from taxes. According to the contract, the protagonist received 2 pieces of Class A gear for free. The principal handed the boy a pen. He said that the contract would be valid until his second awakening. The principal held a pen in front of the guy. He told him to sign the contract. Hake held the document in front of him. He still did not dare to take the pen from the hands of the master of the office. Heck said in a slow voice to the man that he still didn't quite understand. The protagonist asked the director, "What will be the other contract terms?" The man got to his feet and walked around the office. He decided to give the guy the details. The director told the guest that he could not take citizenship of another country during the contract. The man told the protagonist that he could not join the guild for overseas missions. He must consult with the association. If the association wants to do the raid, the guy will do it first. Heck explained that no one could come between him and the association. The interlocutor told the guy that if he joined the guild, any decisions would be made by her. The director told the protagonist that the guild's goals would be prioritized over his personal goals. Heck inquired of the interlocutor, "Are there any other binding clauses?" The man replied that there were no other clauses, but he can't give the guy much time to think. The protagonist replied to the man that he understood. He abruptly opened the contract folder. Heck signed the document. He said there was no need to drag this out any longer. The man asked the guy if he needed time to think it over. The protagonist held out his hand to the principal and explained that he didn't need the time. The man shook the boy's hand and said he liked his determination. The main character was walking down the street with the kids. It was crowded. Heck went into a big store with the kids. There were lots of customers around. Chul happily threw his hands up in the air and said they were in a department store. The main character was walking along with the children in the store. A boy and a girl were looking around admiringly. Chul asked his brother if he could look around. He wanted to go to a clothing store. The girl told her brother that if he made noise here, he would be violated. The main character told her sister to choose for herself what she would like. Young was surprised when she realized that she could buy anything she wanted. Chul asked his brother if he could choose 2 items each. The protagonist told his companions that they could choose 10 items and take whatever they liked. The kids happily threw their hands up in the air and shouted, "They'll take everything at the store." Heck walked between the stalls with his companions. Lately, things had been turning out for him in unexpected ways. He was worried about future difficulties. Heck thought about the end of the pledge defense period. At that time, the brother was called by his sis. Jong picked out a new outfit for herself. She asked the boy how it would fit her. Keol told his sister that the dress was very beautiful and she could take it. At this time, a saleswoman came from the side. Heck was thinking about the benefits of the deal for him. The saleswoman told the young customers that they could not touch the clothes on display. Jong apologized to the woman. Heck thought he now had a big list of tasks to accomplish. He walked up to his sister and the saleswoman. The main character told the salesgirl not to worry about anything. He'll buy whatever the guys want. Heck thought slyly to himself that until he accomplished all the things on the list, he had no reason to leave Korea. The boy and girl were surprised. Someone announced over the loudspeaker that a sudden gate had appeared near the store. The message over the loudspeaker was repeated. A sudden gate appeared outside the department store. Heck, very wary. Visitors were asked to remain calm and follow the instructions of the staff. A woman ran past the customers and shouted that the hunters from the Tekka would be arriving soon. An employee yelled to guests to wait inside the department store until further instructions. People did not understand why they were not evacuating. The woman shouted to people that it was very dangerous to go outside now. They had to follow her to a safe area. A man in the crowd angrily shouted that he wanted to hold first and started knocking people down. The woman shouted to the customers to stop pushing and remain calm. Heck stared angrily in front of him. Heck asked the worker to take his brother and sister to the shelter. He explained to her that he was a hunter and would check the situation outside. The woman was very surprised. She didn't expect to find a hunter in the store. His sister told his brother that it was very dangerous to go outside. Heck thought that the main danger was the department store. He realized that there were 5 D-class monsters next to him. Heck remembered to himself that on that day, monsters were chasing people who were hiding in a department store. After that, the building collapsed. Then the protagonist had no reason to be in the department store. He treated it as a foreign story. The main character told the frightened sister to take care of her brother. The worker grabbed the guys in her arms. Chul shouted to the main character that he wanted to go with him. Heck knew that the Tibet Guild wouldn't arrive until the building was completely destroyed. The protagonist has given himself strict instructions that he must hold out until the Tibet Guild arrives. A large mob of mutants attacked people. Passers-by tried to get out of the place. A guard came running up. He was showing people to take cover in the department store. There was supposed to be a safe house there. A crowd of people tried to escape into the shelter. The guard yelled at them to hurry up and get in. A huge monster was walking down the street. On the side of the street there were frightened people running on the ground and cars driving. Mobs of mutants were walking down the street. They were viciously looking for people. Monsters with horns paced the city street in search of prey for themselves. A whole crowd of people were running scared down the street. They were trying to escape. People were running away and trying to escape the monster. Hake stood calmly in the street and looked in front of him. Hake stood and looked unfazed. People were waiting for the hunters to come to their aid soon. A huge mob of mutants ran at the man. Hake prepared to meet them all. Hek commanded strictly to the system to open up space. A fire portal appeared next to the guy's hand. He decided to switch most of his skills to tank skills. A monster with horns walked up to a guy and yelled at him very angrily. Hek held his shield in front of him. He realized that his guys would be in danger if even one mutant got through. The protagonist got into a fighting stance. He prepared to deal with all the mutants together. The guy activated the acceleration skill. After that, he ran forward quickly. Hake ran past the monster at breakneck speed and knocked him with his shield with all his might. The mutant growled, very angry and disgruntled. The protagonist ran forward past him very quickly. Hake ran full speed past a group of monsters. They couldn't keep up with him. After a very fast jog, the main character slowed down and stopped on the spot. Hek stopped and scrutinized the mutants who were off to the side. The mutants shouted angrily. They all headed towards the human. Hek in a confident voice shouted to the monsters that they could approach him. The monsters angrily, leisurely walked in a group towards the protagonist. Gradually, mutants began to run faster and faster. The protagonist prepared to fight them off. There were a lot of cars on the streets. People were boxed in and couldn't get through. Lee was unhappy because the hunting machine was so slow. He didn't understand why they couldn't get out of here. The driver told the passenger that the street was full of cars and people running away. Police are working to clear the street, but it will take time. Lee was very angry about the delay. He had every second counted. At which time someone put a hand on the hunter's shoulder from behind and patted him. The guy handed his co-worker his phone and told him to look there. The hunter was surprised to see a whole crowd of monsters on the videotape pacing outside. The protagonist stood outside with a shield and defended himself against the mutant attack. The man in the video turned around and told people excitedly that someone was fighting 5 D-class monsters alone. It was unbelievable. Lee watched the video with interest. The passenger couldn't understand what kind of fighter could fight alone against 5 mutants. Hunter remembered the protagonist's face as he approached him and introduced himself as a fan. Lee shouted excitedly with excitement that the man in the video was familiar to him. The passenger turned around and asked the man, "Who was that guy in the video?" Lee explained to the interviewer what they saw on his fan's videotape. The warrior turned around and said in a disgruntled voice to his interlocutor that he was talking nonsense. Lee told the interviewer that he had once returned from Thailand and met his fan at the association's building. The passengers were watching the videotape intently. The author of the video yelled out that he was risking his life when this was filmed. The stranger stood in front of the dangerous monster. He said that if the tank died, it would be the end of him too. The guy told his fans that he keeps them updated on the situation while on the front lines. The stranger looked into the camera and asked fans to show him some support. Lee watched the video carefully. He was deep in thought and didn't say anything. The guy looked at his companion with interest. The man prepared to get out of the car. The young fighter asked the man where the man was going to go. Lee turned around and told his companion in a disgruntled voice that he was leaving to save people. The guy in the car kept calling the man leaving by name. The other people in the car started to get up to get out too. The passenger looked at them in surprise. The people stood up amicably and said they were coming out too. The guy watched them in amazement. The last passenger quickly got out of the car and apologized. The guy was surprised to tell his interlocutor that he had decided to come out as well. Lee Stoyle accompanied by his companions. They prepared to go and fight against the monsters. The commander turned his head to the side and told the subordinate named Cho Huan Wu to stay and look for information on the newcomer. Cho wanted to justify himself and said he didn't even know the guy's name. Lee explained that the guy's name was Choi Jun Hyok. Did he turn around and sharply ask the fighters if they were all ready? The hunters amicably confirmed to the commander that they were ready to go to battle. Lee looked intently in front of him and shouted to the fighters that they had to go forward. The man rushed forward, followed by a group of his subordinates. The evil mutant glared at the protagonist and swung around to knock him down. The mutant slammed into the ground with all his might, and the ground cracked in all directions. Hake took a very hard hit and flew off to the side. He had no time to defend himself. The protagonist came to his senses and jumped to his feet. He saw the monster running at him again. Hake looked in front of him and realized that he was alone against the mutant. He would feel better if someone took on at least one of the monsters. The protagonist concentrated and activated his hypervision. The mutant slammed his paw into the ground with all his might. The guy barely had time to bounce back very quickly. The protagonist ran across the street very quickly. The monster followed him closely. Hake stopped and noticed 2 whole mutants glaring at him angrily. The boy looked ahead of him fearfully. He thought to himself that you don't get into a battle like this for nothing. Hake bounced to the side very sharply at the last moment. He realized that the mutants would attack him. The guy stopped abruptly and prepared to run aside. There was a mutant paw next to him. The predatory monster shouted viciously as it approached its victim. The protagonist thought to himself happily that the mutant had finally been caught. Hake suddenly saw some kind of threat from above him. A large shadow loomed over him. The protagonist looked up fearfully. He saw that the monster was swinging to attack. The mutant raised his paw to nail the man with all his might. A hunter with a large shield ran up from the side to help the protagonist. Lee activated a stun for a future attack on the fly. The hunter ran up and attacked the monster with all his might with a swing of his shield. The mutant flew far to the side after a very strong blow from the man with the sword. Hake stood silently. He looked with great interest at the hunter before him. The commander commanded the fighters named Kim and Chan to both take on one Karkan. Lee said to have a fighter named Jae-hwan check on the remaining survivors nearby. The commander commanded that Tu will come to him and treat the protagonist. He told the hunters in a disgruntled voice that they had come late and he had almost died here. Lee told the boy that he looked weak, but he was still fighting. Lee turned around and told the protagonist that he could still handle the two mutants. The commander told Hake to fight alongside them after he was cured. Hake said it was too much for him, and his knees were already shaking. The hunter ducked down and picked up a shield from earth. He told the protagonist to join them and finish the hunt as soon as possible. Lee handed the protagonist the shield and told him that he knew everything himself. The hunter told the protagonist that the more the battle drags on, the more damage will be done. The man glanced to the side. He noticed the body of a large mutant lying behind him. Hake put his shield in front of him and prepared to fight on. The main character was standing behind the hunter. He said it would be easier for them now. The mutant snapped and ran forward at the humans. Lee and another fighter prepared to fight back. People sat in the shelter of the dungeon. They listened to the news about everything that was going on. The two guys were listening to the latest developments on the phone. The hunters had been fighting for about 3 hours, but so far, not a single Karkan had been killed. Jung sat and listened with great attention to the news. The situation didn't look good. A woman came up and asked the girl how she was doing. Jung said she was very scared. Little brother walked up to his sister and told her that soon their big brother and the hunters would defeat all the monsters. The girl asked her brother, "Will they be all right?" At that time, the breaking news was being broadcast. The boys got very excited. They stopped talking and listened. The news said that one Karkan had fallen. The guys in the shelter got really excited. They shouted that they were able to do it. The boy and girl heard on the news that the hunters' efforts had paid off. Jung asked her brother fearfully, "What is it?" The boy told her that he wanted to see it too. The woman approached the boy and said that it was very dangerous to walk around like that. Chul replied to her that he was only giving her a quick glance. The woman shouted to the child to wait. The boy ran to the side. Two guys were listening to the news. They were told that another Caracal had fallen, and there were only 3 monsters left. The guys got excited. The author of the broadcast and said they were getting messages of support from all over the world. The guys shouted happily that the Tibet Guild was the best in Korea. The boy saw the main character on the tape. He said that this fighter held off 5 monsters for almost an hour. A boy came up from the side and said that their brother was on the tape. Both boys turned around and looked in surprise at the unfamiliar child beside them. Chol explained to his interlocutors that he was their brother in the videotape. The city street was dark and deserted. Only cars were parked. The boy ran very quietly and very fast to cross the street as quickly as possible. The fighter with shield in hand rushed quickly to avoid being spotted by the mutant. The monster was sitting outside. The guy was able to disappear in front of him very quickly. The fighter swung his shield sharply. He was closing in on the mutant. The guy with all his might was able to chop off the mutant's head with his shield. After a 7-hour hunt, the monster's body lay on the ground. The hunter said it was finally over. The main character was very exhausted. He put his head on top of his left hand. Heck slumped to the ground. He told himself that he felt as if he were going to die. Lee looked at the guy and said that was a good job. Heck, lying on the ground, said all he wanted to do was pass out and go to sleep. Lee looked at the guy and asked slyly, "Was it really him?" The protagonist was startled and lifted off the ground. Lee told the guy that he was the one who had awakened and received the highest grade by the judges. The protagonist rose abruptly and sat in a meditative pose. He was silent. Lee looked at the guy calmly and fearfully and called him unusual. The protagonist sat silently on the ground. Next to him stood the hunters and looked at him intently. Hake, after a short pause, inquired of the man, "What does it mean?" The main character heard a child's voice behind him. Someone called out to him and he turned around. The boy along with the girl called out fearfully for their brother. A woman stood next to them. The main character called Jung and Chul to him happily. The children ran to him. The guy asked the kids if they were okay and if they were hurt. Heck cradled the kids in his arms. The boy yelled to him that they were fine and he was protecting his little sister. The main character praised the boy very happily when he heard his words, while he was listening in on the comms for details about the protagonist. The fighter didn't understand what he was supposed to forget. The man looked at the cheerful boy. He told the subordinate that there was no need to find out anything. The main character hugged the kids and told them that when they got home, they would order chicken for dinner. Chul got excited when he heard about the chicken. The girl said she wanted pork belly. The main character told the kids that they would have both dishes. The kids got very excited. A woman came up from the side. The protagonist realized someone was standing behind him. The stranger excitedly thanked the protagonist for his hard work. If not for him, her co-workers would have died with her. Heck got to his feet. He thanked the woman for looking after his brother and sister. The stranger came up to the guy and hugged him. The protagonist felt embarrassed. The stranger had tears in her eyes. She thanked the guy. 20 Heck felt very much embarrassed. There was still a woman standing next to him. People in the crowd noticed the main character. Someone shouted it was the guy from the news. The main character looked at the crowd of people in amazement. Someone shouted that he was talented and good-looking. People ran up to the frightened guy with all their might and started grabbing him with their hands. Someone shouted that thanks to him they were able to survive. The protagonist couldn't understand how strangers could know his name. The main character arrived at the association building. He was in the director's office. He was there looking at a videotape of his battle. The author of the video said that the hero of the battle was a tank named Heck. The author of the video said the guy woke up just a couple days ago. Heck looked at the videotape of his fight. The announcer said the guy got the highest with a class by the judge's decision. The principal laughed. He told the kid that being a celebrity was a big hassle. Heck came over and said in a disgruntled voice to the principal that he was making fun of him. The man told the guy that it would now be a problem for him to deal with the sudden fame. Heck complained to his interlocutor that he gets calls from people who want to recruit him. He added that the association has helped him sort out most of his problems. The principal explained to the guy that if the guy got in trouble, he could contact him. The principal told the kid he had to be registered as special. The man said that the special ones break the conventional rules with something extraordinary. The principal explained to the kid that there are no legal registration requirements for specials. The protagonist sat back in his chair in surprise. He said he wouldn't need to register. The director explained to the boy that if he did register as special, he would get support from the government. Heck asked if he had to go to the US to be registered as special. The man confirmed to the guy that it would be necessary to go to the US. The registration itself would be very rigid. Many people applied, but only 3 people were registered. Heck replied thoughtfully to the man that he would think about it. He couldn't leave Korea because of his little brother and sister. The principal told the kid with a smile that they had decided to increase his support level. The main character could not understand how he could increase his support. The contract had already been signed. The man said that the contract had been drawn up with the expectation of a newcomer with great potential. Now the association had prepared new conditions for the guy. Heck said all this may be premature. He hasn't been registered as special yet. The director told the guy that the association thinks he deserves better treatment. Heck was able to fight against 5 D-class monsters. The support fund for the guy will be raised to 5 billion won. Man told the guy that the amount of Class A gear will be raised from 2 to 5. The main character will get a free hunter car. The main character asked if there would be stricter conditions for him after the support increase. The director answered the guy that the conditions would be the same. The boy hesitated when he heard the answer from the principal. He was silent for a long time. The director looked at the protagonist and asked, "Are the conditions not satisfactory to him?" Heck replied that the conditions were satisfactory to him. The main character approached a man about a car. The principal listened attentively. Heck demanded that the association allocate him an automobile today. The main character was driving a big white car down the street. Heck looked at the ID on the chair. Then he called on the phone to a tank named Lee Dasu, the protagonist. Through his glasses he watched the road. He greeted the man. The guy told the caller that he was his only fan. He reminded him that he was calling because he needed help. Did he ask his interlocutor what kind of help he needed? Lee explained to the guy that he could see him any time. The protagonist offered to see him now. Heck commanded that subspace be opened. A fire portal appeared on the side near the guy. He shouted to the man that it would take him about 10 minutes to get there. The main character was holding a magic plate in his hands. The man on the phone asked him what it was all about. Heck looked at the magic cards on the table. Some of them were very valuable to just sell. The guy put his fingers on the plate and said that he wanted to acquire a skill called mountain splitting. The system explained to the owner that he cannot get such a skill. The user class does not match the skill type. Heck was driving and holding a record in his hands. He asked the man on the phone, "What are his plans?" The main character told the interlocutor that he had prepared a small gift for the hen who had saved his life. Lee didn't realize what kind of gift the guy had prepared. The main character explained that he wanted to give a tank skill card called Mountain Split. The guy was rushing down the street in a car. Was surprised that he wanted to give a skill card that only had 9 copies in the whole world. Heck confirmed to the interlocutor that such a skill is classified as the most desirable. The man responded that it was crazy. The main character told the man that he could use this skill since he is the #1 tank in Korea. He suggested that Lee buy the card from him. Lee couldn't believe the guy was offering him a coveted skill just because of fan loyalty. Heck explained to the fighter that he wanted to ask him for a favor. Heck explained to the person on the phone that when he had mastered the skill, he would have a request for him. The protagonist suggested to the man that he shake his hand when he got the skill. The protagonist arrived at a large building. He went into the office of the hunter. Heck sitting in his office in a chair. Across from him sat a man with an assistant. He held out his card on the table. The hunter looked at it intently. Lou was surprised that there was a real card in front of him. Heck said the card was worth about 40 billion won. Hyuk explained to his interlocutors that if the card was auctioned off, it could fetch more money. The assistant suspiciously told the guest that he didn't want to auction the card and offered it for them. The employee didn't believe the main character wanted to do all this because of fan sentiment. Heck explained that it was up to the seller to decide what to do with the merchandise. He decided that he couldn't use the card. The main character said he'd even be happy to sell the record to someone he doesn't know. The aide sternly asked the guy why he couldn't use the card. Heck explained that he was a first awakened. Also, this whole thing wasn't his specialty. Lee and his co-worker were sitting in silence. They were thinking about what the guy said. Lee asked the employee how much cash they had on hand right now. The guy explained that they had 20 billion in cash on hand. The hunter told the protagonist that he could offer him something other than cash. Heck asked the man if he wanted to offer him a gear swap. The protagonist, along with his companions, approached a huge building. Heck said with admiration that there was a real mansion in front of him. The employee told the protagonist that the sale price of the building is 42 billion won. It has 3 underground floors and 15 above-ground floors. Heck realized with surprise that things had turned out very strangely. He could own the building. Lee walked up to the main character and called his name. The guy turned to the hunter. The man asked the boy with a smile, "Does he like the building?" The protagonist stirred. After a brief pause, he shyly replied that he liked the building. Lee took the card from the guy. He told his new friend that they had an agreement. The protagonist was waiting for the hunter to learn the skill right there. Lee held the record in his hands. He commanded that he was mastering a skill called mountain splitting. Then a very bright blue glow appeared around the man. The protagonist was very pleased. He stood silently and looked at the hunter with joy. The system informed him that he could test his skill in a separate window. The protagonist extended his hand to the man and congratulated him. Lee was the only tank to explore the mountain rift. The hunter rejoiced. The protagonist told him that his position in the Asian top would also grow. Lee shook the guy's hand. He told him what he'd learned would be enough for him. Lee told the protagonist that he had become the owner of the building at a young age. He asked the heckler about future plans. Heck said thoughtfully he would work as a mercenary as he had planned at first. The main character revealed that the main thing for him now will be permanent hunts in the newbie zone. He will only take the D-class assignment. The man excitedly told the guy that he should have enough money. Heck explained that he also has a younger brother and sister. They need to be taken care of too. The main character remembered the death of his parents. He was left on his own with the boys. Heck told me in a sad voice that he had fallen on hard times after losing his parents in the Great Disaster. His youth was a nightmare for him. Heck looked up at the building. He didn't want his boy's future to turn into a nightmare. The guy kept looking up at the high-rise building. He wanted his brother and sister to have a life free from financial problems. Lee looked with interest at the boy. He was struck by the words about a life of hope. The hunter looked up and told the protagonist that his plans for his life would not be possible for him. The main character was very surprised. He turned to the hunter and looked at him fearfully. Lee said thoughtfully that the world was gradually heading towards destruction. Every day the frequency of sudden gates and horrible monsters increased. People's resources to fight mutants were dwindling. They were also dealing with villains. The protagonist remembered a news report about a hunter serial killer. Lee sternly tells the guy that there has recently been a series of hunter killings in the Kanam area. The suspect is a known villain named Cha-Jin Soo, the protagonist thought. He listened to the hunter and thought about the name of the killer. Lee said in a disgruntled voice that you have to fight monsters and also fight humans. The hunter looked up. He told the protagonist that what his boys needed in the future was not a building, but a peaceful sky above their heads with no monsters. Hunter was at the abandoned facility waiting for help. The guy was shot in the arm and was sitting inside the building. He gave a request for help to the association, but no help was sent to him. A villain with a knife and a hoodie appeared from the side. He told the guy that he was bouncing back very nicely. The fighter was frightened when he saw the Sue with the blade in front of him. He told the villain that he had previously fished in the Daegu area. Sue angrily told the hunter that villains come and go as they please. The fighter was angry. He glared angrily at the assassin and decided to try to fight off the villain. Sue looked at the hunter and asked why his teammates were so heartless. The hunter jumped up and lunged forward with his knife to try and strike the villain. Sue very deftly grabbed his opponent and shoved him aside. The villain stabbed the hunter's belly with his knife with a great swing. The fighter lay on the ground moaning. The villain brought his blade to him. Sue looked at the hunter and said angrily that he was going to end it here and leave now. The fighter was lying down and couldn't get off the ground. So asked the hunter if he knew the heck guy who was on the news a couple days ago. The hunter shouted angrily to the villain that he would be burned by devils in the fire. Sue told the guy he was gonna die. He finished him off with another punch. The villain told the dead guy with a smile that he would have died anyway even if he had answered him. Sue stepped aside and stopped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The villain was scrutinizing the video on his phone. Behind him lay the hunter's body. Sue watched the main character battle in the video. He figured he hadn't had a decent toy in a while and didn't know where to start. The villain was silent. He concentrated and continued to review the tape on his phone. Sue put his bloody finger on the phone screen. He decided to rewind the tape to the beginning. The video started playing again. The villain was watching it carefully again. Sue was very pleased with the video on his phone. He laughed harshly and longingly.